11 Days by Stav Sherez. Read by David Thorpe. The first time you see a dead body, it changes you forever. You leave a little piece of yourself behind, but what they don't tell you, what they never tell you, is that in return, you carry something new and strange into the rest of your life. We arrived yesterday. I've never been so glad to land anywhere as I was after that flight. Of course, I had the window seat and could see every flash of lightning that sparked and danced across the plane's wing, the razor-tipped mountains so close below us that I felt as if I could reach out and scoop the snow from their peaks. He didn't even seem to notice when we started plunging. The air squeezed out from our lungs, masks dangling uselessly, the crew buckled down, pale-faced and silent. Nor when we swerved and shook and rattled. He glanced past me out the window when the first engine failed, but didn't say a word. Of course, he'd been popping pills since Heathrow, God knows what and how much, and so I shouldn't have been surprised at all. The town is smaller than I expected. It is hot and dusty and ugly and not at all what I was led to believe. Chain stores and fast food joints line the main street. Everything is in English. Everything is geared towards us, tourists, adventurers, white folk with money to burn. It makes me sick, but he just laughs that cynical laugh of his, the one he thinks makes him out to be cleverer than he is, and gives me that knowing nod, each Starbucks and McDonald's just further confirmation of what he had believed all along. I never noticed it back in London, but it only took one day in this hellhole for me to see him as he truly is. Maybe that's why we travel. Maybe we don't fly and drive and get boats to see new lands, but only to see ourselves and our loved ones as they really are, and not distorted by the mask and mesh of everyday life. On holiday, all your crutches and supports are stripped away, and there's only you and him, and the relentless dead heat of midday. He likes it here, I can tell, and wants to stay. He likes the late-night dive bars and small hole-in-the-wall cafes full of strange alcohol and even stranger food. We argue about this the first night in town. We're staying in a run-down hostel on the edge of what seems like the red light district. The photo on the web looked nothing like this. This is the kind of house you cross the street to avoid walking past. The room is small and close, so that we share each other's breath as we pass, our sticky bodies clinging for a second and then sliding off. There is a fan, but of course it doesn't work. Cockroaches scuttle along the bed and floor. They are twice the size of any I've ever seen before, and they make me constantly uneasy. The way they stop every now and then and seem to turn and face you, antennae twitching, before they decide to scamper off. I tell him we didn't come here to be in another city, to sit in bars with Europeans and drink cheap beer all night. He looks at me like I'm crazy, like what else would we be doing here? It was his choice, this holiday. He'd bought and booked it before he even consulted me. It was the first time he'd done something like this, and I was surprised, sure, and a little excited that he would do such a thing. He said he'd come into some money and had been dying to travel here since he was a little boy. And, of course, I believed him. You're getting used to this, right? You think I should have known better? At night, we sit in the old quarter under candlelight and mosquito buzz in one of the identical bars that line the tourist area. He finds it easy to talk to people, to strike up conversations with total strangers, and within 5 minutes they find they have something impossibly obscure in common. That's what he's like. It's not at all what I'm like, but I pretend for him. I do. I laugh when someone says something resembling a joke. I stare wide-eyed and drop-jawed at their tedious tales of near-death experiences and remarkable survivals. I drink the strange, clear alcohol as it's poured into my glass, and I get the round when it's my turn. But I hate them. I stare at their crooked teeth as they tell me about the time they climbed K2 and had to deal with a kidney stone at 26,000 feet. I watch their eyes as they gush about the ranges in Patagonia or the starving children of Africa, and how their lives were fulfilled when they gave their first mouthful of food to a 10-year-old on the verge of death in the upper Gabon. I hate them because I know who they are. I hate them because I am one of them. At night, you'd see them in the run-down bars on the edge of town, drunk Germans sitting over steins of beer bigger than their heads as they go through their equipment, item by item, for the 4th time, making sure everything's packed for tomorrow's trek. Dead-eyed boys with blonde dreadlocks and less than an eighth of their brain matter left, selling pills and talking about how this used to be a great town before all the tourists came. The history freaks, with their thermoses and pinched expressions, clipped beards and rebel neck scarves. The way they look at us. The way they turn to each other and mutter comments and point and aren't in the least bit ashamed of it. I tell him I'm leaving town first thing in the morning. He can come with me or he can stay here. He throws a fit and hits the streets and comes back 2 hours later, apologetic, reeking of booze and easy women, saying he's sorry and that tomorrow we can start properly. By then I don't care. By then 14 cockroaches, or 40 or 400, have crawled across my legs and face as I lie back in bed and try to will sleep and then give up and ask him for some of his Valiums and chew them, the bitter, chalky taste delicious, and chase it down with some tap water which will probably make me sick, but that's all there is in this room, and anyway, by then, as I said, I'm past caring. We catch a bus out of town and leave in a haze of dust and chickens, the gaudy streets quickly fading behind us as we begin to climb a steep escarpment carved into the mountainside. The bus is beyond hot, and the windows are jammed, and there are all kinds of animals, dogs and pigs and pigeons and God knows what else, and everyone is sitting on each other's lap every time the driver hits a switchback, and I'm sick into my bag within 10 minutes. He looks at me, pats my shoulder, and goes back to his zoned-out state. I wish I could be like that. But instead, I'm the crying, puking white woman who can't even take a damn bus ride, let alone what these people have to endure for every day of their lives in this place. And wasn't that why I came here anyway? The landscape rescues me. The blue, steely peaks in the distance. The jagged precipices of black rock and broken teeth. This track, barely wide enough for the bus, curling and swirling around the side of the mountain like jewellery. Soon, there is nothing but rock and sky and thin wisps of straggly cloud. The temperature in the bus begins to cool, and people are asleep, their heads rolling and nodding on their neighbours' shoulders, and he too is asleep. And I want to scream and shake him awake and tell him, look what you're missing. Look at how beautiful it all is. But I know that even if I did, he would just take one brief perfunctory glance and mumble something and be back asleep within a couple of minutes. So I look at the swooping landscape as it falls away beneath the wheels of the bus, and it feels as if I'm the only passenger left, ascending into the sky, just me and the driver so far in front that I can't tell what colour his hair is or even if he has any. He wakes up and says, "Are we there yet?" It is night, and all around is a rushing blackness lit only by the smear of stars and world galaxies above. Soon, I say, and do not know why I say this, because I have no idea when we'll get to the village that he so wanted to go to in the first place. No idea when we'll get there, and no reason to placate him. Yet I do, which is something I don't understand at this moment and don't care to. Something in the air changes as we round the rim of the mountain and drive through a high, desolate plateau. The smell comes first, sulphurous and hot, instantly filling the bus, everyone coughing or tying handkerchiefs around their mouths and noses. I press my face to my sleeve and look out the window, but there's only the grudging slice of sky and the flat, endless plain ahead. Eventually the smell decreases, or maybe we've just got used to it, and the night lulls me into broken, haunted sleep, and the next thing I know he's shaking me awake and grabbing my sleeve. We get off at what I presume is the bus station, but there is nothing to mark it as such. He tells me the village is 15 minutes' walk over the next ridge. There's a wide animal track that winds through the rocky ground, and we start walking, our rucksacks poking into kidneys and livers and backs, mouths cracked from too little water, and the way this land can suck all the moisture from your body in 2 hours flat. It's more like 40 minutes, but we finally reach the top of the ridge and stop to get our breath back. The village lies below us at the bottom of a ravine. There are no lights on in the houses, and no movement discernible from where we stand. I look at him, but can't tell if he's disappointed or if this is what he expected. He takes a torch out of his backpack, and I carefully follow him down the scree slope, just wanting to get into my sleeping bag now, not caring where, just tired and sick and hungry and pissed off. We come to the entrance to the village, just a couple of splintered stakes plunged into the stony soil. He's calling out in broken Spanish, but there's no reply, no sound at all apart from the wind susurrating through the peaks. I begin to laugh. His awful Spanish accent, the long hours and dehydration, this whole situation. I see him go into one of the houses. He's in there barely a minute and comes straight out, and his body is folded in on itself like he's trying to hide from the sky. There's nothing there, he says, but a muscle twitch below his left eye gives him away. It's the first time I've seen him show this kind of concern towards me, and this scares me more than anything else. He points to a far rise and says we can camp there. It'll shield us from the weather at least, and I'm too tired to argue. Don't want to sleep here anyway. That eerie sound the wind makes, the crunch of our feet on the pebbled ground, the pale, dead sky. We round a small hill, and that's when we first see it. 2 dead trees 300 yards away, hidden in the shadow of a narrow defile. He's standing next to me, breathing heavily, saying shit, shit, shit over and over again. I strain my eyes, all fuzz and sleep-dragged, and try to focus. At first I don't see anything wrong. At first I think it's just a particularity of the tree or the light or the long bumpy hours rushing through my veins. But then I look at the other tree a few feet away and see that it is the same. A slim, black-haired woman is hanging from the branches of the first tree, her eyes staring down at the ground, and she is spinning slowly in the breeze as if she were an unwilling participant in some lost childhood game. The second tree is smaller, its branches more slender, but they are barely bent at all by the weight of the child hanging from them. Part 1. London is a world by itself. We daily discover in it more new countries and surprising singularities than in all the universe besides. Tom Brown, 1702. Chapter 1.
"Who are you?"
the old woman said, pushing his hand away, her eyes wrinkled in confusion. She looked up at the nurse.
"Who is this man? Why did you bring him here?"
Her voice was thin and wheezy, and she lay swaddled in bedding, her skin as rumpled and folded as the blankets covering her. A single tear fell from her left eye, and when Carrigan reached over to wipe it away, the old woman flinched, shrinking back and pulling the sheets up over her head. "It's okay," the nurse said, and it took Carrigan a moment to realize she was addressing him and not the old woman. "Probably better if you don't crowd her. She's very upset at the moment." He took a step back, and then another. He listened to the machines that surrounded the bed beeping away, a slow, rhythmic pulse that mimicked a heartbeat. He could hear relatives weeping in the room next door, the anguished cries and stifled sobs of other people's grief.
"Keep him away from me! Keep him away!"
the old woman kept repeating in a dry rasp, her bony fingers clutching the bedposts.
"I know why he's here. I know what he wants to do to me."
Carrigan stepped back as the nurse tried to calm her with soft reassurances. She gently loosened the old woman's fingers from the bedposts and patted her head as if she were a newborn. The heat in the room was overwhelming, the windows barred, the radiators turned up high. The phone in his pocket was vibrating, but he ignored it. "I'm sorry you had to see her like this." The nurse smiled awkwardly, exposing teeth straight and white, the faintest hint of gum. Her black hair caught the light, and for a brief moment she reminded him of someone else, and years ago. He approached the bed cautiously, studying the old woman. How she'd changed. It was almost as if he were the one incapable of recognizing her, rather than the other way around. She seemed unravelled and trapped, lost in runaway memories, bone pain and boredom. All the things that eventually catch up to you. He leaned over the bed and whispered in her ear. She blinked twice, and it was like she had suddenly awoken from a deep and vivid dream.
"Why didn't you bring Louise?"
she said, grabbing his wrist. Carrigan tried to extricate his arm from her grip, but it was surprisingly strong. He could feel the sharp drag of her nails against his skin, the press of flesh he knew so well, the simple entreaty communicated by this familiar gesture. These were the worst moments, when lucidity peeked through the fog of drugs and dying brain cells, when she remembered briefly who she was and who she had been. "Louis..." The words died in his throat, and he leaned over and squeezed his mother's hand. "She's at home with the kids. I'll tell her you asked after her."
"Why doesn't she come to visit me any more?"
his mother asked, and Carrigan had to turn away, not knowing what he could say or quite how to say it. They stood outside the door to his mother's room, the nurse apologising for the old woman's behaviour, Carrigan nodding and shrugging, barely taking any of it in. His phone kept buzzing, but it was his day off, and he wasn't going to answer it. There were 4 messages from his superior, DSI branch, 3 from Geneva, and several unidentified numbers. Whatever it was, he didn't want to know. "Unfortunately, we see this quite often," the nurse said, interrupting his thoughts. "They start imagining things, almost always bad things. It's as if all the darkness and rage they've successfully suppressed throughout their lives suddenly finds a way out." He turned towards her and shrugged and said, "The brain can be a wonderful thing." The nurse gave him a strained smile, and he could see that under the patina of back-to-back shifts and bedside dramas, there was something beguiling about her face, some slight flaw in symmetry. "She thought the attendants were sexually assaulting her. She tried to escape and fell from the bed. It's lucky she only broke her hip." He nodded, because there was nothing to say to this, no easy answer that would make sense of why his mother's final years should be a drawn-out agony of fear and forgetting. She had been in the nursing home 4 years now, and it had been the most difficult decision he'd ever had to make. But lately she'd been getting worse. The broken hip was only the most recent in a long line of ailments and minor injuries, each taking her one step further away from the woman he remembered. "She keeps asking for Louise, though," the nurse continued. "That's a good sign. A sign that some part of her is still interacting with the real world." He looked down at the cracked linoleum patterned with shoe scuffs and the snaky smears of trolley wheels. "Louise was my wife. She passed away 3 years ago." The nurse gently placed her hand on his arm. "I didn't realise." He could feel the heat of her body filling the cold spaces inside him, and he shivered involuntarily and took a step back, glad that the nurse didn't try to console him with platitudes or empty phrases meant to make him feel better. He looked into her stark black eyes and saw storms and rages and everything she'd ever tried to forget. And he held her stare, until they both looked away, slightly embarrassed. "Thank you for taking care of her." "It's what I do," she replied, her smile tempered by what had passed between them. "My name's Karen. If you ever need anything." He reached out and shook her hand, feeling the warm blanketing of her palm against his cold flesh. "Jack Kerrigan." The phone kept buzzing in his pocket, but he didn't want to look at it, let alone answer it. The walls were peppered with signs telling visitors to turn off their mobiles, and he cursed himself for not having done so when he got here. His mother had been transferred from the nursing home to the hospital in the early hours of the morning, and he felt lost and confused in these blank, tunnelled spaces. He walked past rooms screened off, where he heard relatives talking, arguing, sobbing behind blue curtains. Orderlies brushed past him, pushing shrunken figures drowning in their wheelchairs. Wall-mounted TVs scrolled silent scenes of dusty revolution, earthquake, and endless war. He looked in vain for the exit, but the colour-coded signs only pointed towards the gloom of radiology units, oncology departments, and the recurrent miscarriage clinic. All he wanted to do was get out of here and sink several espressos somewhere dark and empty, where his thoughts wouldn't be crowded by the noise of other people's lives. He turned into another corridor, identical to the one he'd just left. A wave of dizziness overtook him, and he had to stop and steady himself against the wall. He took several deep breaths. The smell of fresh raisin cake filled his nostrils, and he looked around, unsettled, but he could not see its source. And then he remembered. An autumn day, the sun arcing through the windows of the house, splashing the kitchen with golden spray, each dust mote suddenly visible. His mother standing beside him, putting the last touches on his school uniform, and the smell of raisin bread as it cooked in the oven. The way you could almost taste certain smells, and the rough, warm feel of her fingers as she pushed a stray lick of hair from his forehead. And God, how she'd laughed! One of the only times he ever remembered her laughing, as he sank to his knees and knelt in front of the oven, as if before some strange altar, his eyes glued to the miracles occurring within. He tried to shut down the flashing rush of images, to focus on the next few moments, the next few hours, the slow-sipped coffee, the minute he got out of here, the double bill at his local cinema tonight. But it was no use. He started back down the winding corridor, wondering if he would ever find his way out, when he turned a corner and saw the main exit, a group of people lined up in front of the admissions desk, doctors, nurses, and the harried relatives of patients. And then he glanced to the front of the queue and saw Geneva arguing with the duty nurse, earplugs dangling from her neck and a can of Coke in her hand. "I tried calling you several times." She stepped away from the desk, and he saw something in her expression and knew this wasn't going to be good. "My day off," he replied, annoyed, but, he had to admit, also a little intrigued by what would bring her here. He was about to ask when he felt someone's hand alighting on the back of his jacket and his name being called. He turned round to see Karen detaching herself from a group of nurses clustered around the drinks machine. They looked at each other mutely, a couple of feet apart, and Carrigan thought it felt like holding your breath. "Lucky I caught you," Karen said, breaking the silence, reaching into her jacket and pulling out a small white business card. "I forgot to give you this." She looked at it once, then handed it to him. "She'll probably be here a couple of weeks. If there's anything you want to discuss, just give me a call." He took the card and, without reading it, put it in his pocket. "Thank you." She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry. It gets better. You just have to—" "I hate to interrupt." Geneva stepped into the space between Carrigan and the nurse. She stared at Karen, her eyes flat and cold. "But we really have to go?" "Of course you do," Karen replied softly, her shoulders dropping as she turned and melted back into the swirling crowd of giddy nurses. What the hell was that all about? Carrigan snapped the seatbelt into its holder, catching the skin between thumb and forefinger, and cursed under his breath. Something's come up, Geneva replied as she swung the car out of the parking space, through the main gate, and back into the rush and glare of the city. He nodded impatiently and stared up at the bleached sky, realizing that while he'd been inside the hospital, it had started to snow. Small white clumps fell lazily, spinning and dancing against the streetlights as the radio crackled news about a shooting in Peckham, a multiple vehicle collision on the M4, a rape in Richmond. How the hell did you know where to find me? You told me. Geneva almost hit a cyclist, swore, and turned up the radio. Don't you remember? He couldn't, but he nodded anyway, not wanting an argument, having noticed how she'd closed herself down as soon as they'd entered the car. When did the snow start? About an hour ago. She took the Westway, and they glided above the city, shrugging off the pink and brown houses, the dark, wet streets, and streaked parade of blurry lights. The sky turned steely and white as the snow bounced and starred on the windshield. Who was that you were talking to? Geneva asked, her eyes squinted on the road ahead. She seemed very pretty. It's nothing. Were you visiting someone you know? What the hell does it matter? Why am I even here? He leaned forward and felt the seatbelt bite into his shoulder as Geneva pumped the brakes and swerved behind a lorry. Don't shout at me, please. I'm trying to drive. This wasn't my decision. He took a deep breath, looked down, saw the coffee she'd bought for him going cold in the drinks holder. Sorry. Christ. It's been a long day. It's going to get longer, I'm afraid, she said, and this time he thought he could detect a note of sympathy in her tone. She reached for her lighter, the car starting to swerve across lanes. He took the cigarette from her mouth and lit it, the sudden taste unleashing a deluge of memories, then passed it back to her. Branch came to see me. She took several quick drags, screwed up her face, and threw the rest out the window. Wasn't happy. What's so damn important he has to ruin my day off? She looked at him for the first time since they'd got into the car, her lips pressed tightly together. I don't know. He just told me to get you. He gave me an address, said there's been a fire. A fire? Carrigan shook his head, wondering if this was another of the super's increasingly irritating attempts at winding him up. Branch had never liked him, and, after the events of last autumn, he no longer even bothered to hide it, sending Carrigan on wild goose chases and waste-of-time inquiries whenever he could get away with it. Jesus, why us? We're not the bloody fire service. Geneva stared at the road ahead and said nothing. A year now they'd been working together, and she was just learning to read his moods, knowing that when he got like this, it was better to keep quiet and let him burn himself out. Being partners on the job was a lot like marriage in that respect, she thought, and then wished she hadn't, as the memory of Oliver, her ex-husband, came rising up out of the dark. They descended from the flyover and splashed back into the city, and suddenly it was all around them, the shuffle and hum of people, 11 days before Christmas, trying to get their shopping done, chatting and smoking outside pubs, kissing goodbye on street corners and staring up in wonder at the ghostly discs of falling snow. But inside the car, there was only silence. Carrigan closed his eyes, a headache beginning to spread across his skull, and took 3 deep breaths, his nostrils suddenly puckering. His eyes snapped open. He sniffed the air and checked the back seat. I hope that's not your cigarette. He'd meant it as a joke, but somehow it hadn't come out like that at all. Geneva didn't answer, but she rolled up her window, and he knew that she'd smelt it too. They turned off Queensway and into a narrow residential street, parked cars and spindly trees bordering them on both sides. The smell was stronger now, more acrid, and the day had begun to darken rapidly, as if a curtain had been pulled across the sky. Geneva stopped the car, and they both sat there in silence. Through the murk of twisting smoke and smeary haze, they could see a sky lit up in orange and red streaks. Carrigan stared up, entranced, everything else forgotten for the moment, and it took him a few seconds to realise that something was wrong. He blinked, but it didn't change a thing. He opened the car door and looked up at the sky, unable to believe his own eyes. Black snow was falling on the streets of Bayswater. Chapter 2. A thick column of smoke rose above the tall houses of St. Peter's Square. The far end of the street was blocked by 2 fire engines, a police patrol vehicle, and a gathering crowd. "It's like bloody bonfire night," Carrigan grumbled as Geneva parked the car on a double yellow line outside the Greek Orthodox Cathedral. The black snow was coming down heavy and thick, and it was getting hard to see. The lights of the fire engines and patrol vehicles streaked and smeared against the dizzy profusion of snow. Carrigan was unprepared for the sheer noise of the fire, the crackle and roar filling his ears as they made their way down into the square, past the fire service barricades and the silent trellised homes whose residents were crowded on narrow balconies, their heads craned towards the raging spectacle, eyes wide in mute astonishment. Carrigan searched for the uniforms, but there were so many people all moving fast that it was hard to get a sense of the scene. Fire engines edged towards the burning building, their ladders projecting into the night, hoses unfurling, the firemen wiping sweat from their brows and conferring among themselves. A small group of onlookers had managed to get past the initial cordon and were staring up, hypnotised, while others held phones above their heads as if in supplication, pushing one another aside for the best view. And yet, above all this, there was a sense of quiet celebration, of expectancy, perhaps the hope for a sprinkle of seasonal magic to light up everyday life. "Christ, it's a fucking circus," Carrigan said, approaching the fire command unit. Geneva tugged his sleeve and pointed out 3 uniforms standing and watching the blaze, as transfixed as the public. From somewhere, maybe the next road along, they heard the ghostly voices of carol singers getting louder and then diminishing as the wind changed direction. "Who's in charge here?" The uniforms turned to see Carrigan standing behind them. They quickly adjusted their postures and looked at the floor. "Forget it," Carrigan said. "We need to set up a perimeter. Did no one think of that?" The 3 looked at each other as if they'd been caught smoking by a teacher. Carrigan ordered them to start clearing the area of onlookers and residents. He stared up at the large, detached house, now totally engulfed in flames, yellow and red and blue, silently praying that the occupants had been shopping when the fire broke out. If the house had been empty, it would mean he could hand the case over to another team. "Happy Christmas," he told the constables, and headed towards the main fire truck. He talked to the driver, then stood and waited for the fire marshal to emerge from the burning building. They were at the narrow end of the elegant garden squares that Notting Hill and Bayswater were so famous for. The houses were tall and white, imposing and austere as Roman temples, with their profusion of fluted columns and ornate pedestals. The burning building was 2 from the end. It was covered in a shawl of flame, the wind whipping it into scattering phantoms and flickering patterns. Black smoke poured into the sky. Residents from the adjacent premises were leaving in a panic, families with bulging backpacks and bewildered looks on their faces, their evening meals suddenly turned into life and death. Carrigan saw the firemen spraying water from thick grey hoses which kept kicking and bucking in their hands. The snow kept coming down. The crime scene was being destroyed as he watched, and there was nothing he could do about it. He finally saw the fire marshal emerge from the black smoke, covered in soot and dust, his eyes tearing from the fumes, his body crumpling with each sustained burst of coughing. Carrigan flashed his warrant card, and the marshal stopped, took out a handkerchief and wiped his face, leaving it streaked like a soldier on night patrol. Behind them, Geneva was helping the uniform set up a perimeter, the crime scene tape screeching and mewling like a hungry infant as it was stretched across the road. Carrigan turned to the marshal. "Any idea what we're looking at?"
"One hell of an insurance claim,"
the man replied, and when Carrigan gave him a dark look, he laughed.
"Just kidding."
His name tag said Weir above the left pocket, and he was short and squat.
"It looks like the fire's been going for at least an hour. We'll be lucky if we can save anything."
Carrigan wrinkled his nostrils at the smell, an acidic reek of burning plastic and wood that settled at the back of his throat. "Is it safe to go inside?" Weir shook his head.
"Too dangerous. These houses, too much wood. Everything's collapsing."
On cue, a tremendous crack split the air, and a burning beam sheared off from the front of the house and landed in the garden, exploding in a shower of sparks. Carrigan felt flashes of heat and light behind him and turned to see a news van parking alongside, 2 cameramen already out and taking photos. Christ! The fire marshal grimaced.
"Made their day, this has."
Carrigan liked the man's understated cynicism and was glad he was in charge. He was about to ask him something else when a muffled cry turned them both in the direction of the burning house. Initially, Carrigan could see only smoke and fire, and then he made out the faint outline of a couple of bodies emerging from the darkness. At first, he thought these were survivors, but then, as the smoke cleared, he recognised their yellow helmets and dark, dusty jackets. He followed Weir across the street. They reached the edge of the garden, and the heat was terrible, unlike anything he'd ever felt before. The firemen, emerging from the smoke, were carrying something, and, as he got closer, he could see that it was one of their own, blackened by soot and convulsing as if in the throes of an epileptic fit. The marshal immediately called the paramedics stationed nearby. Carrigan could tell that the injured man was on the verge of slipping away, his face red and blotchy, the skin already pulsating, his eyes rolling white into their sockets. Weir spoke to the fallen man, held his hand and squeezed it gently, then stood up.
"Jesus,"
he said, wiping his brow.
"He's been in the house. He's been upstairs. You better listen to him."
Carrigan knelt down, feeling the sweat and heat engulf him, and he could only just make out the man's voice above the roar of the flames. "What? What did you say?" The injured fireman tried to repeat what he'd said, but he broke into a fit of coughing, vomiting a thin yellow stream of bile onto the pavement beneath him.
"There's..."
His voice wheezed and stuttered and broke.
"Upstairs! But..."
Carrigan leaned closer until he could smell the man's burnt flesh, dark and funky and familiar in his nostrils. "There's a body up there." The fireman shook his head, and even that small movement seemed to cause him incalculable pain, his eyes turning small and pale.
"More than one."
"How many?" The fireman started convulsing again, his teeth cracking loudly against one another.
"All over the place."
He coughed and spluttered and retched.
"Everywhere! There's fucking bodies everywhere!"
Chapter 3. Ambulance sirens now added to the general noise and chaos. The fire continued burning, the wood cracking and breaking, the sizzle and hiss of water hitting flame filling the night like the beating wings of 1,000 butterflies. "I need to get inside," Carrigan said, sweat dripping into his eyes. The fire marshal was signalling his men, pointing out areas of the blaze they weren't covering. He was talking on the radio, his voice low and deep as he recounted the situation, his eyes fixed on his fallen colleague being stretchered into a waiting ambulance. He put down the handset, took off his gloves, and pulled a packet of chewing gum from his pocket.
"Want one?"
Carrigan shook his head. "When can we go in?" He was impatient now, wanting to see what was waiting for them in there, what they would have to deal with over the coming days.
"Not for a couple of hours at least," Weir replied. "Not unless you want to end up like him."
Carrigan followed his eyes towards the stretchered figure, groaning and shrieking in pain as they raised him onto the ambulance bed. "I need to get in there," he repeated. "I need to see what we're dealing with." Weir nodded. "We don't get this under control in the next hour, all you'll be dealing with is ashes and dust." Carrigan found Geneva helping the uniforms extend the cordon. The public was swaying and cramming against the blue and white crime scene tape, their mobile cameras held aloft, shopping bags discarded for the moment as they posed in front of the burning building. He pointed to a small cleared space and led her away from the noise and press of the crowd. He kept having to wipe sweat from his face, and he was tired and hungry and pissed off he'd missed his movie. Geneva called for more backup as Carrigan rounded up the uniforms. "Stop looking at the fire," he told the young constables, "and start looking at the people looking at the fire." They stared at him, confused and disoriented. "Start asking questions. Some of these Gorpers might have seen someone running away from the scene. They might have been here when this started. They won't be here long. Once the fire's out, the entertainment's over, and they'll go back to their homes and we'll never know what they saw." He stopped to wipe away more sweat popping on his forehead. "Look for the usual. Anyone who suddenly decides it's a good time to leave when you approach. Anyone staring too hard. And pay close attention to people's hands when you're interviewing them." "Their hands?" a petite female constable asked. She didn't look old enough to get served in a bar. Carrigan nodded. "Look for anyone with soot or dust on their hands, but what I really want you to do is smell them." "Smell them?" This time, it was all three uniforms who stared up at Carrigan as if a madman had taken over the case. "Yes, the crowd are too far away to pick up the smell. Here." He raised his arm and pulled on his sleeve. The cloth released its vapour, and he watched with satisfaction as the uniforms wrinkled their noses. "That's what you smell like if you've got too close to the fire. But, more importantly, look out for anyone who stinks of petrol." He watched as the young female constable took notes. "Do you have a video camera in the patrol car?" he asked her. "We do." "Good. Go get it. I want you to circle the crowd and film them. Do it several times so you get everyone." "Film them?" She stopped writing and looked up from her notebook. "People who start fires like to watch them burn," he replied, remembering a course he'd attended on this very thing several years back. They love to see their handiwork. It's what gets them off. Chances are, whoever set the fire is standing in the crowd right now, watching it. "How do we know it's not accidental?" she asked. "We don't. But if it's not, then this is our only chance at this." The sound of crashing drums and squealing guitars burst through the night. Carrigan and Geneva looked up and saw a group of people standing on a balcony diagonally across from the burning house. They were passing around a bottle of champagne, smoking cigars, and watching the fire with rapt expressions. "Christ," Carrigan muttered. "Someone tell these jokers this isn't some bloody Christmas party." The uniforms nodded and avoided Carrigan's eyes. They chattered among themselves for a moment, then spread out to tackle the crowd. "You okay?" He hadn't even realised she was still standing beside him. "I can imagine better ways to spend my day off. Do you have any idea why Branch called us in?" But Geneva wasn't paying attention. He saw her look past him, squint, then frown. "You can ask him yourself," she said, pointing over to the perimeter and then quickly turning back. "Oh my God, I hope that's not who I think it is with him." Carrigan brushed some of the dust off his jacket. It had mixed with the melting snow and now lay like an oil slick across his clothes and face. He straightened up as Branch approached, but it was the other man he was watching. "Assistant Chief Constable Quinn," he said neutrally, as the pencil-thin figure next to Branch stepped forward. "I'm surprised to see you here." Quinn came to a stop a foot away from Carrigan. He was a tall, bony man, all angles and points, always neat and fastidious, with a whispery moustache perched on his upper lip, making him look more like a mournful pre-war bank clerk than the third most important man in the Met. "And why is that?" Quinn's dry enunciation filled the air around them, crisp and hard as a whip-crack. "Do you all imagine that I do nothing but sit behind a desk?" Carrigan had never been able to read the man and couldn't tell if this was his attempt at humour or a rebuke. "I just meant this is a fire. Accidental for all we know. Why bring my team into this?" Quinn sucked the insides of his cheeks, his eyes probing Carrigan's, as if searching for some obscure meaning behind the words. "I happen to live on this street," he said, pointing behind him. "I heard the fire engines, looked out, and saw where it was. I called DSI branch immediately." Carrigan was certain he'd missed something. He glanced over at the burning house, then back at Quinn. "Where... what was?" "The fire, young man! The fire!" Quinn replied tersely. "Now, D.I. Carrigan, let's stop wasting time. What do we know?" "Not much, as of yet," Carrigan admitted. "Still too dangerous to go in, but one of the firemen reported seeing bodies." "Oh, no," Quinn said, cupping his forehead. "What?" Carrigan saw the ACC's face sag and blanch, saw Branch shaking his head. "What is that house?" "It's a convent." Quinn looked up, and Carrigan noticed the rings circling his eyes, the drawn and puckered skin. Late night smoke and booze, a lifetime of bodies and blood. "A what?" He wasn't sure he'd heard right. "Nuns, D.I. Carrigan. Nuns lived there." "Oh, shit." "Yes, quite," the ACC said. "I want you on this, Carrigan. I asked Branch specifically. The work you did last year, that dreadful child soldier thing, earned us some good points with the public. I want you in charge." "Sir, I think we should wait and see what the fire investigator finds. It's just as likely this was an accident." Quinn seemed to be weighing this up. "Just as likely, yes, you could say that. But how would we look if this turned out to be intentional and we were caught behind the curve on it?" He pointed to the two white vans. "The press are already here, Carrigan. The press are already asking questions." Carrigan nodded, noting that Branch hadn't said a word during the entire conversation. "Do you know how many nuns lived there?" Quinn turned to Branch and smiled for the first time, his lips sticking defiantly together. "See, Jason? That's why I want him on board. Already asking the right questions." Branch's eyes turned small and fierce as Quinn addressed Carrigan. 10, Detective Inspector. 10 nuns lived there. My wife donated money to them. She's very upset, as you can imagine." Quinn's eyes suddenly narrowed. He looked up as a blast of reggae made its way from the balcony across the road. "What in God's name are those people doing?" "Someone's on their way over." Quinn nodded curtly, conferred with Branch, then brushed some of the black snow off his suit and disappeared back into the smoky night. "Not my decision." Branch was sweating heavily, his face blotchy and crimson. "Didn't think it was," Carrigan said, but before Branch could reply, he felt a tap on his back and turned round to see the fire marshal. "You ready?" Carrigan nodded and followed Weir past the cameramen setting up their tripods, the reporters practicing their lines, the sound of triggered car alarms and distant guitars wailing. "How bad is it?" Carrigan asked as they went through the gate. The marshal looked up at the blackened shell of the house and shook his head. "Bad," he said. "Really bad." Chapter 4. The smell was overwhelming. It was like nothing he'd experienced before. Not the reek of decomposed corpses in dark basements, nor the salty tang of freshly spilt blood, but something almost physical. "Careful," Weir warned as they made their way through the front garden. "They'll burn a hole right through your shoe." He pointed to the smouldering pieces of wood spitting and hissing on the path. But Carrigan's eyes were drawn to the sky. "What's with the black snow?" "It's that way because of the fire," Weir explained. "Soaks up all the ash and dust on its way down." "Nice," Carrigan replied, turning back towards the convent. The main structure was no longer burning, the firemen retreating their ladders and hoses, the top of the building covered in clouds of billowing steam as water cascaded from the gutters and eaves. The air was filled with bursts of cracking and popping, loud groans and moans coming from the wood as it contracted violently against the cold water, making the house seem as if it were alive and extremely disgruntled. They could see into the building as if it were a doll's house in some little girl's bedroom, or one of those models that architects use to pitch new designs. But there was nothing new here. Only staircases that led into empty space, door frames gaping like open mouths, windows blown through, the glass twisted and melted and reconfigured into nightmarish shapes. "It's, still unstable, so we can't spend too long." Weir was chewing gum, his lips smacking against each other. Snow had collected on his hat and clothes. "A fire investigator will go through it tomorrow morning, and you should have his report by the afternoon." He stopped and turned towards Carrigan. "Very unusual for you guys to get here so soon." "Tell me about it," Carrigan said, thinking about his encounter with the ACC. He knew that Quinn's presence meant it would be one of those cases, the kind he dreaded the most. "We're lucky we got here ourselves when we did," Weir said, leading him into the reception hall, but Carrigan wasn't listening. He stopped, turned back, and inspected the entrance. "What?" Carrigan pointed to the door frame. The wood had been badly burned, but the slim metal locks were still in place. Carrigan used the sleeve of his jacket to brush away some of the soot. There were 4 mortise locks spread evenly along the door frame's length, 3 chubs, and the housing for 2 heavy-duty bolts. "A lot of locks," Weir said, a low whistle escaping his lips. "Yes," Carrigan replied, "especially for a convent." The marshal nodded somberly and turned back into the reception hall. The outside wall had collapsed and brought down a portion of the roof, exposing a rectangle of sky through which the snow drifted slowly down. A staircase rose steeply to their left. Carrigan followed Weir past the melting, bubbling plastic, half-burnt umbrellas and empty coat stands, their metal hooks steaming in the dark. "Can you tell if this was arson?" Weir started to say that he wasn't an investigator, but Carrigan wanted to know his first impressions and told him to continue. "I got a good look at the flames before we went in." He passed through a small corridor now exposed to the night. "You know about flame and colour spectrums, right?" Carrigan didn't, but nodded anyway, his throat dry and scratchy from the soot and dust. "Basically, we can tell what kind of fire it is from the colour of the flame. Different materials burn with different heat signatures. Blue flames are nearly always an indicator of accelerants, which often means the fire was intentional. I didn't see any of that here. The fire burned mainly red, with some yellow and only sporadic flashes of blue. It looks like no accelerants were used, and the seat of fire appears to be singular rather than multiple, which is what we would expect to see in cases of arson. Then again, I'm only guessing. We'll know much more when the investigator's done." Carrigan stared at the ruined house, trying to visualise what it must have looked like before the fire, how the corridors and rooms connected and what their functions had been. "Do you know if the bodies are all grouped together?" The marshal thought for a moment and nodded. "We haven't been in the basement yet, but the ones we found upstairs were all in the same room." Carrigan filed this bit of information away. He knew it could mean any number of things, but it would help them reconstruct the series of events which had led to the fire. Where? Weir pointed directly above, and they climbed the stairs and turned right on the first-floor landing. At the far end was an empty door frame, revealing a room shrouded in smoke and haze. As he entered, Carrigan saw a set of dark smudges aligned across the floor. How many? The marshal checked something on one of his instruments, then stepped through the door frame. We haven't managed to count them yet. The smell in this room was different. Still the acrid tang of burnt wood, the acidic reek of melted plastic, but also something else. Carrigan tried breathing through his mouth, but then he could taste it, and that was worse. It really did smell like barbecue, and that was what made it so horrible, the close relation to pleasure, the way the tongue could not distinguish between the two, and he tried not to think about what he was actually breathing in. This room took some of the worst damage, Weir said. The fire started in the chapel directly below, so it burned for a long time before we could get to it. They both coughed and spluttered, and Weir took a small collapsible fan from his belt and set it down. As the smoke dissipated, the dark blotches on the floor began to take shape. They were evenly spread out in 2 rows. They looked like small children, the black and brown skin snagged tight against the bones, the arms and legs curled into each other in a fetal boxer's position. It made them appear as if they died fighting, struggling desperately against the confines of their own skins. Carrigan leaned down next to the nearest body, the small shriveled form giving off steam as the eyes still bubbled in their sockets. He got up, nauseated and dizzy, and started to count. They were arranged in an almost geometrical pattern around a humped mass of grey ash situated in the centre of the room. They were all reposing in virtually identical positions. It didn't seem like any of them had tried to escape. There was none of the scatter pattern you normally saw in a fire, the panic and fear driving the victims to try all available exits and windows. No. This looked like they'd sat and waited for the fire to consume them. Or maybe they hadn't been able to move, Carrigan thought, and made a note to ask the pathologist about that. He studied the mound of ashes in the centre and saw the silver glint of cutlery, broken china, a scattering of small black stones, the metal edges of chair supports, and knew they'd died where they'd sat, around the dinner table, gathered for their last supper. He blinked the image away and counted again. Just as Quinn had said, 10 bodies. The fire had got them all. A beam cracked above him, showering dust and sparks down on his jacket. He stood up and made his way towards the stained glass window high on the west wall. There was no way anyone could have reached it, let alone used it to escape. He walked past Weir without saying a word and stopped and looked down at the remains of the door, using his foot to sift through the debris. Most of the wood was gone, only splinters and slivers remaining, skinny as fingers. He leaned down and picked up a darkened doorknob, still brassy under the patina of soot. He looked at it for a moment, then put it down. He used his hand to sift through the rest of the ash and stopped when he felt the cold touch of metal. He reached over and picked up the object and examined it. Still think this was an accident? He handed the fireman the dull, disfigured lock that had once been part of the door. Weir took it and held it in his hands, turning it over several times as if confused of its function. The cylinder was engaged, and the 2 pieces, lock and housing, were embraced in an unbreakable kiss. The door was locked, Weir said, and then his radio crackled, making them both jump. The fireman spoke into it in short staccato bursts. He clicked off and looked up at Carrigan, his face puzzled and strange. What is it? I'm not quite sure how to explain it, Weir replied. You better come downstairs and have a look. The size of the chapel surprised him, the fact of it lurking invisibly in this nondescript house. Smoke obscured the far edges, the nave, altar and rood screen. Firemen were rushing around, putting out small blazes erupting in corners and niches. Weir spoke to one of his colleagues, nodding rapidly, then turned towards Carrigan.
They heard something moving in there.
He pointed to a line of confession booths against the far wall, their metal frames hissing sibilantly. They heard something. Weir nodded.
Yes. A thump.
Carrigan looked in the direction of the booths. There were 3 of them, now reduced to skeleton remains of metal and charred timber. He stood and listened, but there was only the crackling of the rapidly cooling wood, the hiss and sputter of dead fires. The firemen had stopped what they were doing and were all gathered around him. He took a step forward and carefully opened the door to the first booth. A pocket of trapped smoke burst out, momentarily blinding him. He went over to the second booth and tried the door, but it was locked.
Anyone got a penknife?
Weir passed a small folding knife over to him, and Carrigan carefully ran it through the gap between door and frame, unlatching the lock. He turned and handed the knife back to Weir. He pulled the handle, but the lock snagged and caught and the door jammed. Carrigan was about to give it another yank when something moved inside the confession booth, thudding against the door. The sudden weight and pressure made Carrigan jump back. They all watched the door of the second confession booth with held breath and unblinking eyes. But there was no further sound nor movement. Carrigan took a step forward and gripped the handle so tightly that he could feel his own pulse throbbing through his fingers as he waited for whatever it was behind the door to move again. He could hear Weir talking behind him, but not what he said. He could feel the pressing weight against the door, and he gently turned the handle and gave it a sharp pull. The jammed lock broke, and the door swung open. It came tumbling out with a breath of charred meat and bitter smoke and landed hot and wet in his arms. The smell instantly filled his nostrils and mouth. He stumbled back, but the body clung to him fiercely, the weight not much more than that of a small child's. He resisted the urge to rip his hands free and slowly got to his knees and lowered it onto the floor. He got up quickly, wiped his hands on his trousers. He felt like he was going to be sick, his forehead blazing and stomach churning as he forced himself to focus on the twisted remains lying by his feet, a slippery figure curled in on itself like a broken question mark. Chapter 5. He'd missed his morning coffee. As he sipped his glass of water, he looked out at the sea of faces gathered in the main room of the CID building. Flashbulbs popped and stuttered, making him squint and blink as reporters found their seats for the morning's press conference. It was the worst possible way to begin a case. Carrigan had wanted to start the day with an initial briefing to his team, but Branch had been waiting for him in the incident room. The press conference had been set up last night on ACC Quinn's express orders. Quinn now sat to his right on the podium, the Met logo draped behind him, Branch flanking Carrigan's other side. Carrigan took another sip of water, feeling everyone's eyes on him. His head raged with pain, his stomach flip-flopping like a roller coaster. He hadn't got drunk for a long time, but he'd got drunk last night. In the living room, in his favourite armchair, watching the cars outside his window ignite the darkness. He'd fallen asleep and dreamed of his mother trapped in a burning church, strapped to her bed, slowly disappearing into herself and into time, and woken up dishevelled and dream-haunted and itching to get back to work. Sometimes he thought the job, the obsessiveness it required, the long hours and bad dreams, was a way for him to avoid the complicated process of actually living a life. Other times, he knew it was so. He cleared his throat, stood up, waited for the cameras to find their focal point, and began. At around 6 o'clock last night, a house in St. Peter's Square caught fire. The fire brigade were dispatched to the scene and managed to bring the blaze under control before it could spread to any adjacent residences. Flashbulbs popped, and Carrigan raised his hand to shield his eyes. When the firemen deemed it safe to enter the premises, they discovered several bodies. The building housed a convent used by a small group of nuns. We're appealing to anyone who might have seen anything unusual in the vicinity of 33 St. Peter's Square yesterday evening to contact us. Carrigan took his seat as cameras whirred and competed with the bray of questions from the gathered reporters.
Is it possible that this was a ritual murder? Black magic? A young woman from Sky News asked.
Carrigan tried to find her face among the bobbing heads. We're not yet certain that this was an intentional fire, so to make such far-flung speculations would be silly. The woman frowned and wrote something down in her notebook. Carrigan pointed to a reporter from the Times, but before the man could get his question out, another voice, painfully familiar, rose from the pack.
Is there any truth to the rumour that this was a terrorist act?
Carrigan scanned the densely packed crowd of reporters till he found Khan. George Khan had been working at the Standard for almost as long as Carrigan had been in the Met. Everyone in the department knew of his reputation for sudden non-sequiturs and subtle word traps, and they had all learned to avoid him if they could.
You know as well as I do, George.
Carrigan glared at the overweight reporter, his suit crumpled and stained, a bottle of Lucozade in his hand, and an unlit cigarette jumping between his fingers, that rumours such as that have no place in our investigation. Carrigan suspected that Khan had, in all likelihood, made up the rumour himself just to get a quote. There is absolutely no evidence of anything that could be construed as a terrorist act. This wasn't a bomb. This was a plain, ordinary fire that went out of control. We will, of course, be consulting with the fire investigation team as to how it started, but that's all to come. As of now, we are treating the fire as suspicious, but no more, and I certainly won't comment on what are mere rumours. He sat down and immediately felt the ACC's hand on his arm. He turned to see Quinn looking even more ghostly than he had the previous night. The man obviously hadn't got any sleep.
Good work,
he said quietly into Carrigan's ear. These things are never easy, son. You've done a good job. He was on his way out when he heard Quinn call his name. The cameras and journalists had departed, leaving them alone in the cavernous hall. I want you to do this clean and fast. Understand? Quinn said. It's probably nothing more than some crazy firebug, so you know what to do. Carrigan nodded. He could see why Quinn had got a reputation as the most feared man in the Met. Behind his polite facade, there was a steely authority which made it clear he wouldn't stand for any mistakes or lame excuses. The timing's particularly bad here, Quinn continued. The public have a lot more sympathy towards nuns during the festive period. The press have nothing else on their plates. It's imperative we wrap this up before Christmas. Sir, Carrigan said, knowing this would be his one and only chance, I'd rather you gave this to another DI. I'm in the middle of something else at the moment. Quinn coolly appraised him. DSI branch didn't mention anything? No, of course not, Carrigan thought. A 16-year-old boy went missing 3 days ago. Young boys go missing all the time, you know that as well as anyone. This is different, sir, Carrigan continued. I believe this is linked to several other disappearances over the past few years. I know this is the work of one man, and I don't think we have much time if we want to find the boy alive. Quinn nodded quietly and sank his hands deeply into the pockets of his uniform jacket.
You're in charge of the investigation into this fire. Did I not make myself clear?
His eyes were cold and pale as a winter sky.
It's time to think about your future, Carrigan. Promotion to DCI. Handle this case right and I'll put a word in. This other thing you can pass off to someone else. I want you fully focused on the fire and nothing else. The press will have their eye on you, Carrigan. Remember that.
Chapter 6. The new building. They still called it that, even though the murder investigation team had been here almost a year now. Carrigan made his way past the main station entrance, checking the daily incident logs to make sure he was up to speed with what had transpired overnight, then caught the lift, still bristling from his encounter with Quinn. The offices were the latest in ergonomic design. Gone were the old yellowed rooms with their institutional fug of microwaved food and stale coffee, and in their place were large square spaces, each a replica of the other, fitted with beeping machines and electronic hums that guaranteed you could never get a moment's peace. He entered Incident Room 2 and saw that Geneva was already there, sitting at a desk near the back, almost invisible in her cubicle, going through a large stack of reports and slugging on a can of Coke.
How was it?
She put the files aside and swiveled her chair towards him. She was wearing a red blouse and a dark skirt, her lower lip swollen from biting down on it, something he'd noticed she did when she was upset. "Quick, thank God," he replied, and started shifting chairs to the main table where they would hold their daily briefings. "The ACC even called me son, if you can believe that."
"Sounds like we may not have you for long," she replied. "I heard that when he calls you son, it means you're on the way up."
"I heard the opposite." Carrigan smiled and pulled out his briefcase. He extracted a handful of A4 photographs of the scene and started pinning them to the surrounding walls. Behind him, he could hear the team coming in. Sighs, short and frequent, nods and subdued greetings, a studied reluctance in every movement and gesture. Everyone knew what was waiting for them, courtesy of the non-stop footage broadcast and looped on last night's news. "Thanks for coming in early," Carrigan began, wishing he'd nipped out for that coffee now, his voice scratchy from the smoke. "As you know, we're launching an investigation into the fire at 33 Peters Square. We'll have 2 daily briefings here as per usual." He ignored the moans and scattered comments from the uniformed constable surrounding him. "What we know as of this morning is that 33 St. Peter's Square wasn't an ordinary family home. The building was used as a convent by a small group of nuns." He looked down at the hastily scribbled notes in front of him. "The Sisters of Suffering, apparently. Before you ask, I know as much about nuns and orders as I do about quantum theory, which is precisely nothing. The diocese have confirmed that only 10 nuns lived on the premises. Now, as most of you know, St. Peter's Square is not your average street. It's probably the most exclusive address on our patch. Several lords, a sheikh or two, and of course our own assistant chief constable live there, so we're going to be treading on some toes. That's inevitable." "But we have no indication that the fire was deliberate, right?" D.S. Carlson was dressed in a tight pinstripe suit, his hair gelled back, and his stubble a dark charcoal shadow on his jaw. His shoes were shiny and black with pointed tips, and he was tapping one heel impatiently against the leg of his chair. "Correct, John. We don't know that yet." "Or isn't it a bit premature setting up a major investigation before we know all the facts?" Carrigan bridled at the sergeant's insolence. He knew how important it was to have someone to challenge his basic assumptions and keep him sharp, but there was something else underlying Carlson's tone, something he didn't like. "I agree, but it's not my decision. Seems that ACC Quinn has taken a personal interest in the case. I think his wife donated money or time there, so until we know better, we treat this as a murder inquiry. That way, we won't get caught out if it does indeed prove to be intentional. If it's an accident, then we'll all get to enjoy our Christmas, no harm done." Except to the nuns. Carrigan's gaze found Geneva busily scribbling away in her notebook. "Thank you, Miller. I think we're all aware of that." He looked up at the photos he'd pinned to the walls. Burnt doorways and cracked windows, the dark smear patterns of soot and dust. I'm scheduled to meet the fire investigator later today at the scene. He's spent all morning going through the rubble and should be able to tell us whether we're wasting our time or not. I'm told the house is now more or less stable, the soccos have finally gone in and the bodies have been transferred to the morgue. He paused, slightly out of breath. It's Christmas. People get drunk and do things they wouldn't do any other time of year. They play dares and get careless, so keep that in mind. Carrigan looked over at his team and sighed. He knew it was the worst possible time to start a murder inquiry. Everyone looking forward to well-earned time off, Christmas all planned and prepped for, and he could see that their minds were elsewhere, little tells of daydream and starry absence. For him, it was different. He knew the case would take his mind off the festivities and rush of unwanted memories that always came with them. Cuddling in front of black and white movies. Louise's yelp of excitement as she unwrapped the tree. Hot, slow kisses in the rumpled morning. He shook the memory free and continued. Cases of arson tend to be either easy to solve or bloody impossible. It's a crime that wipes out its own traces, but in doing so, it leaves other traces. That said, the snow isn't going to make it easier for us. Let's hope the soccos got there before too much damage was done. Now, there are normally 3 motives for arson. He pointed to the photos of the smoking wreckage pinned up behind him. 1, the perpetrator gets off on it. 2, the fire is used to cover up another crime, usually murder. And 3, the arsonist has something against that particular property or institution. So we should be thinking about why anyone would have wanted to burn down the convent. Was it a drunken prank that went badly wrong? An accident? Or is the fire somehow symbolic? Did someone want the nuns to burn in hell even? Remember, this isn't merely a case of arson we're investigating. This is murder. Someone killed 11 people in that building. 11? D.C. Singh looked up from her files. Carrigan told them about the 11th victim, the corpse in the confession booth. There were only supposed to be 10 nuns in residence, but we have 11 bodies. It's important we keep this detail out of the press for now. I'll be seeing the diocese later today, so I'll find out if there was a cook or visitor on the premises, but we should initially focus on this person. It's significant she wasn't found with the others. He stopped and waited for them to take this in, then turned to face the whiteboard next to him. He began jotting down names and tasks, his handwriting impenetrable as ever. Singh, I want you to see if you can find out whether there have been any threats or complaints lodged against the convent in the last couple of years. Are you thinking hate crime? Or an abused child taking revenge? D.C. Singh flicked back her lock of black hair, and Carrigan was again reminded of her quick intelligence and unerring ability to get straight to the point. I'm not thinking anything yet, he answered. Let's see where the evidence leads us first. He pointed to the whiteboard. I've drawn up an initial wall chart detailing the positions of the deceased. We need to find out the nuns' movements and routines. Did they always take dinner together? Did they always take it at the same time? Why did they make no move to escape the room? He looked across the table at the serious-eyed young man crouched behind a phalanx of humming laptops. Berman, I want you to go through the video footage of the crowd watching the fire. I got one of the uniforms to film it. Arsonists hang around the scene. They get their kicks from watching things burn. If that's the case, then it's likely our perpetrator's on tape. We may get lucky. He looked at his team, trying to offer them this small comfort as they slowly came to the realization that this investigation was going to mean disappointed relatives, refunded train tickets, and presents sitting on a shelf come Christmas morning. Jennings, take a couple of uniforms and start door-to-doors. I'll be joining you later. The snow began falling at 6 last night. People would have been looking out their windows or sitting on their balconies, he continued, remembering the fire party last night. Someone may have seen something. A person running away.
anything. He turned to his sergeant. Carlson, I want you checking recently released firebugs. Jennings, cross-reference what Carlson finds with the video. Oh, and Carlson, see if there's been any similar fires in the area recently. He scanned the table once more, satisfied that all bases had been covered for now. I'm sure you're well aware that all Christmas leave will be cancelled if this turns out to be arson and we're left holding the bag clueless. He waited for the groans and sighs to subside. The press is watching us carefully. The public is watching, and Quinn is watching. So let's do everything by the book. If things turn out badly, at least we can say we followed every possible line of investigation. He closed his policy book and looked up. Remember, he said, every act leaves a mark upon the world. It's up to us to find those marks and decipher them, and let's try and not get too carried away. It could be nothing more than a simple accident, a prank gone wrong. But that's not what you think, is it? Carlson interrupted. If I was a betting man, I'd say cancel your appointments for the next few days, Carrigan replied. And I hope you've already done your Christmas shopping. So, we're looking at this as arson? One of the uniforms asked. Murder. Not just arson. 11 people died, and this in itself makes me suspicious. But it's not only that. 3 things bother me. The fact that the fire started right below where the nuns had just gathered for their evening meal, the fact they didn't try to escape, the 11th victim. Chapter 7. God, you still stink of smoke, Geneva said, rolling down her car window. He noticed she was wearing a new jacket today, one he'd not seen before, and it made her look older and somehow graver. Could say the same about you. He pointed to the empty pack of cigarettes on the dash, the gaping ashtray too full to close, and smiled as Geneva turned down Westbourne Grove, heading towards their appointment with the bishop. Managed to get any sleep last night? He asked as they stalled in traffic. Barely. Ended up watching some stupid Italian slasher film till I fell asleep on the sofa. Sounds familiar. Carrigan laughed. You ever watch anything apart from horror films? Used to. Not much anymore. I like knowing the way it's going to unfold. Horror films have a structure, and that's comforting. She risked a glance at him. Why? What kind of movies do you like? Ones I don't understand. A film Jack Carrigan doesn't understand. I'd like to see that. Her nails clicked on the steering wheel as she drummed her fingers in frustration while waiting for the lights to change. There was that peculiar look in her eyes he'd noticed before, a rumble of contained energy written in every muscle twitch and eye flicker. What's bothering you? She fumbled for her cigarettes, then gave up. I didn't want to bring this up in front of the others. But, Carrigan said, watching her carefully, come on, I know that look. You may as well tell me. She felt her cheeks flush, embarrassed at having been read so easily, yet at the same time secretly pleased he'd noticed such a thing. Dare I mention the words mass suicide? She said, and saw his eyebrows arch slightly as he continued staring out at the snow-covered pavements. I very much doubt it, Carrigan finally replied. Really? She said, her voice dropping slightly. It's not that uncommon to find enclosed religious sects who believe the end of the world is coming and who kill themselves in preparation for the rapture. Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, the list goes on and on. This is an established religious institution, not a cult, he said, a little too sharply. There's a difference? He scratched his beard and listened to the whip-whap of the windscreen wipers as he considered this. Yes, there is. Something had opened up between them in the unsaid words, a space neither realised had existed. And I suppose you have something to back up your theory? Funnily enough, she replied, I do. The diocese's offices were located in a sprawling church deep in the heart of Pimlico.
The car park was full, and priests and seminarians walked past them, hunched in conversation and thought, utterly oblivious to the two detectives as they made their way to the front door. Carrigan pressed the buzzer. The door opened, revealing a young man dressed in brown monk's robes and a thick mop of black hair that almost totally obscured his eyes.
Yes?
His accent was so clipped and rarefied that it only took that one syllable to evoke an entire world of country houses, tweed jackets and private gentlemen's clubs on Pall Mall. Carrigan pulled out his warrant card.
We have an appointment with Bishop Price.
The seminarian nodded once, then turned and headed back down the hallway. They followed him through a twisting panelled corridor studded with saints in agony and beatific virgins, photos of monks and priests and politicians lining the walls. They turned a corner, and he pointed to a wooden bench beside a large arched door.
You can wait there.
They sat on the bench, the wood cold and unyielding, and only 6 inches deep, so that they had to tense their feet against the floor to stay upright like dozing medieval priests perched on their carved misericords. Carrigan stared up at the coffered ceiling and tried to count the angels hiding in its folds.
Detective Inspector Carrigan, I believe we have an appointment.
Carrigan hadn't noticed the door next to him open and was startled, almost losing his balance on the narrow bench.
You're not Bishop Price?
He said, quickly gathering himself together as he looked up at the man standing beside him.
Quite right, which must make you the detective.
The man offered his hand.
Roger Holden, I'm the diocese's press secretary. I'd be happy to help you with any questions you may have.
Carrigan stood up and shook his hand, flinching slightly at the unexpected pressure on his fingers and the way Holden looked directly into his eyes as he did this. The man was in his early 40s, an expensive haircut framing a bland, square face, teeth gleaming white behind fleshy gums. He wore a pink pinstripe shirt that looked as if it had been squeezed out of a tube of toothpaste, and he smelt faintly of soap and mint.
Our appointment was supposed to be with the bishop.
Holden smiled apologetically as they entered the office, the corners of his eyes crinkling. He wore a silver ring inset with a small ruby on his little finger, and he kept worrying it with his other hand.
Unfortunately, the bishop is indisposed right now, but I'll be happy to provide you with whatever information you may need.
Holden took his seat behind a large, neatly ordered table, the papers and stationery all squared and aligned. Bookcases lined 3 of the walls, packed tightly with leather-bound volumes, serious and grave in their uniformity. A row of metal filing cabinets stood to the left. A small oval oil painting on the far wall drew Carrigan's eye. It depicted a group of 3 unnaturally elongated figures sitting around a campfire and peering fixedly into the flames. The scene was lit from the centre, shadows spreading like black fingers across the canvas, and there was something sinister about the way the shadows fell, as if independent of their origin. It made you want to get closer, to see what the figures were so entranced by, but of course you would never know. That was the point of the painting. Next to it sat framed certificates and more photos of people Carrigan didn't recognise, handshakes and glossy smiles beaming from each one.
A drink?
They both nodded, and Holden carefully poured some water from a silver jug, careful not to let a single drop land on the table. He took a small white handkerchief out of his pocket and used it to dry the lip of the jug before placing it back on the tray.
So, you're in charge of investigating the fire?
Carrigan nodded.
A terrible thing. Terrible,
Holden replied, folding the handkerchief neatly into 4.
We're still trying to come to terms with it. As you can imagine, Bishop Price is most upset.
He looked up and placed the handkerchief back in his pocket.
Now, what can I help you with?
We'd like the personnel files on the nuns so that we can start identifying the bodies. Carrigan was surprised that Holden hadn't asked him whether the fire had been deliberate or not. It was almost always the first thing anyone wanted to know in such cases.
Of course, that won't be a problem.
Holden replied, making a note on a peach-coloured piece of paper. We were also hoping you could give us some information on the convent. What were the nuns like? What kind of activities were they involved in? Anything we can gather may help us in determining why this thing happened. Holden smiled and said, I think only God knows the answer to why. Well, since God's not going to hand in his findings, we'll see what we can do. Holden turned and stared at Geneva as if surprised to find her there. Carrigan had noticed how he'd studiously been avoiding her until now. Holden took a sip of water, his lips barely touching the glass. You won't have to look far, then. There are plenty of people who don't like us. They've never liked us, not since the 16th century. But of course, no one says so. They tolerate us because we keep quiet, and because they need our dogma to justify themselves. What do you mean? Geneva asked. Anglicans, the non-believers, the atheists and their ilk, they need us. They need our intransigence over contraception, abortion, euthanasia. They need it to highlight their own normality, how rational their belief system is compared to ours, how far they've progressed. But religion is not rational, nor would we want it to be so. Mystery is the abiding nature of God. Ultimately, our roles are really not so different, Detective Sergeant Miller. We both have a set of rules we abide by, and we both try to stem the flow of evil in this world. He looked at her for affirmation, then, finding none, continued. What do you know about monastic orders? Only what I've seen in films, Geneva replied, and Carrigan felt a momentary snap of anger towards her, but then noticed the look on Holden's face and kept his mouth shut. There are two main types of order, monastic and mendicant, Holden explained. The former spend all their time cloistered and concentrate on prayer, while the latter have a greater emphasis on missionary work. The convent in Bayswater, the Sisters of Suffering, were part of a mendicant order. They were involved in good works and community outreach, as well as their prayers and devotions, and they subsisted on donations. You say you want to know about the nuns. Well, the convent actually has a very interesting history. Carrigan watched silently, letting Holden dictate the pace of the interview, allowing him to slip into comfortable routine and slick patter. He knew it was often when people were at their most relaxed that they gave themselves away. The convent was founded by Constance Bellew. I don't suppose you've heard of her? Holden looked up, saw them shaking their heads, and continued. She was the 1910s equivalent of someone like Kate Moss, the girl everybody wanted to know. She presided over weekly salons, wrote several books of poetry, hung out with Pound and Wolfe, the whole Bloomsbury set. Then the war intervened, and she gave it all up and volunteered as a nurse. She spent 3 hard years in the Dardanelles and at the Western Front, and it was among the amputated limbs, shattered minds, and unassailable volume of the dead that she found her place. A Catholic by birth, but never before by inclination, she began to read Teresa de Avila and Julian of Norwich in her tent during the eerie, gunless nights, and when the war ended she joined an order of nuns, and a few years after that took her vows. But she soon sensed that there was something missing from her new life, and she kept thinking back to how she had felt in the trenches among the wounded and dying, and realized that a life of contemplation and withdrawal was not for her. A couple of years later, in 1924, she formed the Order of the Sisters of Suffering in a disused building in a run-down part of town full of tenements and bedsits called Notting Hill. She believed that it wasn't enough to pray to Jesus, one also had to live like him, to spend your life alleviating the sufferings of the poor. In the years which followed, the Great Depression, the millions standing in breadlines, there was a lot of work to do, and Sister Constance found her calling.
She reorganized the convent and set the rules by which they would function, including the rule of 10.
The rule of 10? Carrigan interrupted.
She believed the number was the perfect balance, that too few nuns would be inefficient in their task, and that too many would lead to a dilution of purpose and factional dissent. Unfortunately, Sister Constance died during a Luftwaffe raid in the winter of 1943. The nuns had refused to leave the convent during the Blitz, and spent their days ministering to the wounded and newly homeless. After the war, the convent flourished, renewed greatly by Sister Constance's sacrifice, and was a tremendous boon to the community during the tense and racially divisive years that were to follow. More recently, the convent was headed by Mother Angelica. She has been the abbess for the past 12 years. In her tenure, the convent greatly expanded its charity works and role in the community, from the battleground schools to the homeless shelters under the Westway. Their focus, over the last 5 years, has been predominantly in dealing with the scourge of drugs sweeping through our streets, setting up rehabilitation centres and workshops and organising the community. Indeed, over the past 8 years, the convent received several commendations from the Vatican for their outreach work.
You know the history of all the orders in your parish in such detail?
No. I prepared myself this morning when the bishop told me you were coming.
So, otherwise you had no particular dealings with this convent?
No, Detective Inspector, I did not. What exactly are you implying?
Carrigan shook his head. Nothing. Don't pay any attention to me. I was just thinking out loud. He flicked absently through the pages of his notebook. Now, would there have been anyone else in the convent yesterday evening apart from the nuns?
No, of course not,
Holden replied. You seem very sure of that.
The nuns have done a lot of outreach work, but the convent was their personal space, and there certainly wouldn't have been anyone there yesterday evening. It was the feast of St. John of the Cross, an extremely solemn and private occasion for them.
Carrigan nodded, thinking about the timing of this. What about a cook or a caretaker? He caught something in Holden's expression before the man answered.
They cooked their own meals and made their own beds. That was part of Sister Constance's rule, to ensure they never grew reliant on outside help.
Carrigan leaned forward and placed his arms squarely on the table.
Tell me about the caretaker.
Holden briefly looked away. How did you... Never mind. He twirled the ring on his finger.
It was against the rules, but they did employ a part-time caretaker. There were some things that the nuns just couldn't do by themselves, but it was more an act of charity, I believe. He was one of their strays, one of their countless lost sheep, a wiry little man by the name of Hubbard, Alan Hubbard.
Holden shrugged.
They always had their little pet projects.
Did Hubbard live on the premises? Carrigan asked, wondering what it was about the caretaker that made Holden so uneasy.
No, of course not. He came once or twice a week to fix things. That was all.
Do you have an address for him?
Holden shook his head. As I mentioned before, this was not done with official sanction.
And there was no chance that the nuns had invited him over for dinner? Maybe felt sorry for him? One of their lost sheep? Holden looked at Carrigan as if he had just inquired whether the convent employed a stripper.
No, of course not. The Feast of St. John was a holy and onerous occasion. There certainly wouldn't have been any guests. That's ridiculous.
Ridiculous? Carrigan repeated, writing the caretaker's name down in his notebook, and next to it the number 11 and a question mark. The pathologist at the scene had, on cursory examination, determined that the bodies were probably all female. But Holden had described Hubbard as wiry and small. Could the pathologist have been mistaken in his initial assumption? Carrigan gripped the pen a little tighter, feeling a flutter surge of adrenaline at the thought that they had either identified the 11th victim or found a possible suspect. I'm nearly finished, he continued. Sorry to have taken up so much of your time. Just wanted to clear something up. Your diocese has overall authority over the convent, is that correct? Holden smiled. I wouldn't call it authority, no. But your office was in charge, Carrigan persisted. How much do you know about ecclesiastical governance? Carrigan was about to say not much at all when Geneva interrupted. I know that the diocese is responsible for all religious orders within its boundaries and acts as a kind of governing body, should conflicts arise. Holden studied Geneva carefully before he answered. Yes, quite right, he said, though that does make us sound like some kind of local council. Convents differ from parish churches in that they're far more autonomous, as you'd expect, so we don't often have day-to-day dealings with them. Generally, we only deal with problems that arise, otherwise they pretty much run themselves. And did problems arise? Geneva asked. Holden met her gaze and said, No. No problems at all. No problems at all? No threats or complaints? You're sure about that? Of course I am. Everything concerning the bishop goes through me first. Geneva looked puzzled as she took out a thick green file from her bag. Isn't it true that there was a serious dispute between the convent and the diocese? Holden stared at the ring on his finger, his tongue flicking briefly across his lips. I wouldn't call it serious, no. Nothing more than a minor disagreement. Really? Geneva flicked through her papers, dropping several on the floor. As she got to her knees to pick them up, Carrigan could see Holden's lips twitching with impatience. She finally sat back down and pulled out a single photocopied sheet from a 3-month-old newspaper. If it wasn't serious, then why would the bishop issue a writ of complaint to the order's headquarters in Rome? Holden almost managed to hide his surprise, but not quite. He shook his head, as if annoyed at having to explain something very simple to someone for the 4th time. These are arcane matters of theology, Detective Sergeant Miller. I'm not sure you would appreciate the subtleties. You're quite right, Geneva agreed. I don't really understand much of this, which is why I looked it up earlier, and, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, such a writ of complaint is only issued in matters— She glanced down and paused as if reading the next sentence from her printout, but Carrigan could tell she knew it off by heart. Matters of urgent or extreme deviation from the creed. You seem very well informed. It's my job, she replied, bristling against the smooth purr of his voice. So, humour me for a moment. If, for instance, the nuns believed in apocalyptic imminence, in the end of the world, then that would be a reason for the bishop to issue such a writ? Geneva stopped, noting the crinkle in Holden's brow, the way his eyes had narrowed slightly. You believe the nuns killed themselves because they thought the end of the world was coming? Holden laughed. Detective Sergeant, please. These nuns dedicated their lives to helping others. This wasn't some misguided cult. This was a long-established and rule-bound order. He rose from his chair and leaned across the table. I advise you to tread carefully here. You can't start bandying about the first thing that comes to mind, starting all sorts of rumours. This was a much-loved and well-supported convent. Is that a warning? Carrigan asked, impressed by how Geneva had managed to rattle Holden. Merely a statement of fact, Holden said. Carrigan nodded blankly and wrote something down in his notebook. Talking of facts, Mr. Holden, would it surprise you to know that there was someone else in the convent yesterday evening? An 11th victim? After all, according to your statement, that would be impossible. For the first time since they had got there, Holden's expression slipped, and Carrigan caught a flicker of panic and something else beneath the well-heeled charm. 11 bodies, Holden repeated to himself.
We must be mistaken. That simply can't be.
Merely a statement of fact, Carrigan replied. Chapter 8. The fire investigation officer was perched on the bumper of his truck, smoking a cigarette and reading a book. His helmet lay next to him, and snow covered his blonde curls and lined the curves of his droopy moustache. Carrigan made his way through the slush, feeling his socks turning wet and cold, and introduced himself. The fire investigator nodded once and finished the sentence he was reading. He put down the book, and Carrigan saw it depicted the blackened bodies of burnt victims displayed in glossy colour and intimate close-up, scrawled notes and bright yellow post-its covering the page. Kirk, the investigator introduced himself, not specifying whether this was his first name or last. He was at least 4 inches taller than Carrigan and twice as wide, but he carried his size lightly, moving with a deft assurance as he offered Jack a cigarette. 1.5 years, Carrigan said, waving away the pack. Me too, Kirk replied. He lit his cigarette and laughed, blowing smoke out into the night. The snow kept falling, thicker and thicker clumps, soundlessly lighting on their hair and clothes, blanketing the street around them. You finished in there? Kirk stubbed out his cigarette and nodded. You want to grab a drink and I'll talk you through it? Carrigan smiled and pulled 2 paper espresso cups out of the take-out bag he was carrying. I want you to show me. Kirk looked Carrigan up and down as if he had initially mistaken him for someone else. It's not really safe, he finally said. Neither is smoking, Carrigan replied with a slant smile and led the way. Now that the fire was out, the real extent of the damage could be seen. The blackened shell of the building smouldered and sizzled darkly in the morning air. A hissing skull with empty window frames and gaping doorways made all the more sinister by the normality of the houses on either side. Kirk handed Carrigan a fire jacket and hard hat as they crossed the front garden. Some of the trees had caught fire and stood blackened and skeletal, smoke rising from their stippled branches. The change in temperature hit Carrigan as soon as he stepped inside the house. The air was thicker, dusty and sour, and he began to sweat under the too tight hat and clumpy jacket as he followed Kirk through the hallway and up the stairs. They walked across the landing, avoiding the places where the floor had collapsed to reveal black holes, yawning like pulled teeth, and entered the dining room. The parquet flooring had turned black, blistering like sunburnt skin. The painted canvases had melted from their copper frames, leaving new designs, tongues of smoke and flame, a narrative of blister and peel. 2 wheelchairs sat in the corner of the room, arabesques of steam rising like probing fingers from their seats. Random mounds of ash and metal lay scattered across the floor. A large crucifix hung above the fireplace, the figure still smoking and blackened beyond recognition. Carrigan crossed over to the centre of the room and peered down at a set of dark smudges spotting the floor. That what I think it is? Kirk squatted on his haunches and nodded. He was biting the ends of his moustache between his teeth, his jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed. The Sockos took the bodies away this morning, but yes, that's what you're looking at. Human tissue burns much more fiercely than wood. That's where they died. Something cracked behind them, and Kirk looked back uneasily. We shouldn't stay here long. The kitchen floor collapsed overnight, and this one's next. Carrigan ignored him, bending down and examining the black patches. Each expertly traced the shape of the body that had left it, as if their very shadows had been trapped at the moment of death. He got up and began to count. He did this twice, and each time he got 10. 10 black smears, 10 bodies burnt down to ash and memory. Doesn't it seem strange to you that they're so neatly positioned around the table? Carrigan took 2 steps back and inspected the mound of ashes which lay at the centre of the room. That's the dining table, right? And here,
He pointed to one of the dark smudges. "And here, and here, and here, the nuns are sitting around the table when the smoke creeps through the door. Okay, that makes sense. But why are they all in the same position when they die?" Carrigan shook his head and scanned the room. "You'd expect that as soon as they smelt the smoke, they'd start to panic and try to find a way out. We should be seeing bodies scattered in a random pattern, or at least closer to exits and windows. All we have here is 10 dead nuns who seem to have quietly sat at the dinner table as the fire entered the room, and who continued sitting at their places until the fire consumed them." "Perhaps they couldn't move because they were tied up," Kirk said quietly. Carrigan looked down at the zigzag canyon cracks in the floor. "Could you tell from the lock whether the door was fastened from the outside or inside?" Kirk shook his head. "No, only that it was locked. But we didn't find any key." Carrigan thought about this as they stood among the ash and dust. "If the door was locked from the outside, we'd still be seeing a scatter pattern, right? People still panic even if they know there's no way out, which suggests that maybe the door was locked from the inside." "Why on earth would they want to do that?" Carrigan shrugged. He thought back to what Geneva had said earlier. Maybe he needed to let her follow her instincts. She'd been right before, and it reminded him of being young and eager and new to murder work, and how the years of practice and experience had dulled and withered his hunch sense. He stared at the black smears and thought about the nuns' last remaining moments, the agony and fear and panic as one by one they succumbed. What prayers, what regrets and childhood memories flashed before their eyes in those final fleeting seconds. He crossed over towards an alcove and checked the surrounding area, but there was nothing of interest there. He looked up at the high, inaccessible stained glass window, the stately procession of pain and suffering enacted on the way to Golgotha, then turned his attention to the wall below, using the torch to run light up and down its coffered surface. The wall was empanelled with square insets made from a darker wood. The wood had blackened and blistered and peeled, the years of dust and varnish and smeary touch erased in flame. There was no way anyone could have gained purchase and climbed it to get to the window. Would the nuns have known that? A sudden thought flashed through his head, and he crossed the room and squatted in front of the remains of the table. He could see the dulled edges of cutlery poking through the debris, teapots and trays, broken glass and cracked porcelain, a fork missing its tines, and a swan-shaped salt shaker, its wings tarnished black. But he wasn't interested in these. It was the small black objects peppering the ash that he now examined. Carrigan bent down and picked one of them up and rolled it between his fingers. It was still warm, and when he tilted it towards the light, he could see the pinprick tunnel threading through it. He put it back down and selected another, but he already knew what he was looking at. When he was finished, he got up, his knees cracking painfully, and pointed to the round black stones dotting the floor. Their rosary beads were kept under their habits on the waist. We shouldn't be seeing them all over the place like this, unless they had them out when the fire reached them. Carrigan looked down. And that doesn't make sense. Why would they all have their rosary beads out when they were sitting down to dinner?
"Downstairs is where things start to get interesting,"
Kirk explained as they exited the dining room and made their way across the landing. Carrigan couldn't help thinking there was something about the house, beyond the damage wrought by the blaze, which made it seem oppressive, as if gravity had more purchase here, a fleeting sense of agony and confinement which made him eager and impatient to get back out on the street. As they passed the door, which led down to the basement, Carrigan stopped. He looked down at the blackened set of steps disappearing into darkness.
"We can't go down there until tomorrow at the earliest," Kirk said. "You wouldn't last 2 minutes in there. If the stairs don't get you, the fumes will."
Snow was falling in the chapel.
The outer wall had collapsed, and wind-blown flurries danced and scurried in front of them. Steam was still curling from the walls, white puffy coils which dissipated in the frigid air. Dotted around the room were niches and hidden cloisters, screened-off areas, and the row of confession booths, making the room seem smaller than it actually was. At the far end, where the space opened up into a large hexagonal bay, stood the altar on a raised stone platform, a darkened crucifix smoking behind it. Carrigan stood silently taking in the scene, the language of niches and candlestands, the hewn syntax of rood screens and mystical vision and seared eyes. He walked over to the confession booths and searched the skeleton remains of the two on either side, then the one where the body was discovered. Most of the wood had burned, leaving only the metal doors, the spiny supports and screens. Yet, despite all this, they still looked eerie and magnificent. He stepped inside the booth, the smell heavy and rich in his nostrils, imagining the people who had sat here and poured out the worst moments of their lives into the blank and faceless screen. Pulling the torch out, he aimed the beam at the back of the door and took an involuntary swallow of air as he saw the marks on it. He splashed the light left and right and saw that they were everywhere, up and down across the surface of the door. He snapped on his gloves and used the back of his hand to wipe away the top layer of soot. The marks were more like scratches, you could see that now. Small crescent-shaped grooves in the metal, overlapped, random and furious. She was alive when the fire got to her. She was trying to get out, he said. Kirk craned his neck and saw the frenzied palimpsest of scratches that the 11th victim had made. He took a deep breath and shook his head.
Not necessarily. This close to the seat of fire, the flames would have got to her before the smoke could knock her out. Those scratches may have been involuntary.
Involuntary?
As she burned, her muscles would have contracted and popped, and she'd have flailed and lashed out. I'm afraid it would have been an extremely painful few minutes.
Jesus, Carrigan said, stepping out of the booth, trying to rein in the dread images conjured by the fire investigator. He scanned the room, the dark ceiling, the mottled floor. Where did the fire start? Kirk pointed to a large bayed niche at the opposite end of the room, and they slowly crossed the nave, weaving through the scattered debris and mulch until Carrigan stopped and wrinkled his nose. What's that smell? He could feel it in his nostrils, sour and caustic, an underlying stench behind the stink of the fire.
You noticed it too?
Kirk came up beside him.
We're not quite sure what it is.
He pointed down at the floor to an area that was darker than the rest.
From the amount of ash, it looks like there was a large item of furniture here. Maybe a chest of drawers or bureau. I took a sample and sent it off to the lab. We'll know soon enough.
They crossed the room, and the fire investigator gestured towards the wide semicircular niche in the west wall, a single blackened statue at its centre.
That's your seat of fire.
Carrigan looked at the dark patchwork of marks behind the icon, then craned his neck and saw the burnt ceiling beams and partially collapsed floor of the room above. Black fingers of smoke snaked up the walls in twisting spirals, as if they too had tried to escape the flames. Kirk aimed his flashlight at a dense hatchwork of soot and grime to the left of the statue.
See how the damage is worse here than anywhere else?
Carrigan found it hard to tell one scorch mark from another, the seemingly random mosaic of burn shadows and ash smears vaguely sinister, a perpetual flicker at the periphery of his vision. But for Kirk, the chaos of smudge and burn was like an open book, one whose language he could easily decipher.
What we have here is your classic V pattern, telling us this is where the initial temperature was the highest. That was a table.
Kirk pointed to the 2-inch deposit of ash spread evenly across the floor, grey and flecked with small shiny particles. Next to it stood a twisted frame of hissing metal. It was rectangular in design,
and composed of 3 horizontal sections with Gothic tines of blackened metal rising from its crossbars like accusatory fingers.
No idea what that is. Looks like one of those medieval torture devices,
Kirk said quietly, and he was unprepared for Carrigan's throaty laugh. It's a pricket stand, Carrigan said. You find them in most Catholic churches. They're usually dedicated to a saint. That's what the statue is. People light a candle, put some money in the collection box and say a prayer.
Didn't help them much, Kirk replied. All these bloody candles.
He shook his head and pointed to a set of metal rods fixed to the wall, small cylinders with empty brass rings hanging loosely from them.
Drapes or curtains, Kirk explained. Textbook fire hazard. The candle must have fallen over and ignited them. The fire would have then spread up and across. Once it hit the drapes, there'd be no stopping it.
Carrigan studied the niche, then made a sketch in his notebook of the relative positions of pricket stand, table, drapes, and saint. He took out his phone and snapped a few shots. And you're absolutely certain this is where the fire started? Kirk smiled broadly.
It's physics and geometry, not a matter of opinion.
Any evidence of accelerants? Kirk shook his head.
Not that I can see. No pool marks, no residual smell. The candles, the drapes, the painting. You wouldn't need anything else, he said, biting the ends of his moustache again.
Carrigan nodded and stared at the blackened statue. He didn't recognise the saint. The figure was tall and thin and seemed unruffled by its present condition, an enigmatic smile planted on carved grey lips. He took a couple more photos of the statue's face and turned around, studying the layout of the room, then took several steps back and looked again at the pricket stand, and from this vantage there was something different about it, a subtlety of shade and angle revealed by the slanted slabs of spilled light. The pricket stand had been positioned a couple of feet away from the back wall, but it wasn't quite flush. The left side of the stand was closer to the wall than the right by maybe 2 inches. Carrigan fished the torch out of his pocket again and splashed light onto the area. He got to his knees, the floor cold and hard, and scanned the space around the stand, using his sleeve to clear the ash. He licked the tip of his gloved finger and rubbed away the fine coating of soot until the surface of the floor was uncovered. He angled the torch in and hunched forward, running his fingers up and down the 2 faint scrape marks trailing from the pricket stand's left leg. He got up slowly, thinking about this, and took a step back. Somebody moved the pricket stand, he said, pointing to the floor. Moved it so that the candles would be positioned directly beneath the drapes. Chapter 9.
I've never talked to a police officer before.
Well, there's a first time for everything, Geneva replied, slightly surprised by the tone of her own voice. She'd been put through to John Staples, the editor of the Catholic Tribune, and had expected someone older, stuffy, severe and impatient, but the man on the other end of the line possessed a calm reassurance. She had spent the last hour going through the files the diocese had sent over, but could find nothing about a dispute. Yet Holden had denied it strenuously, and this didn't make sense. She looked at the pages and reports scattered across her desk and felt an unexpected wave of excitement. This was her favourite part, always. At this stage, it was all paper and chaos, an avalanche of random and hidden data obscured in black type and binary code, and she loved the challenge of it. The blood rush when events and facts began to separate themselves from the main group and cohere into new and startling patterns. I'm investigating the convent fire, and I was wondering if you could help me with something. She told Staples who she was and explained what she had found out about the convent's dispute with the diocese. But, to be honest, I don't really understand much of it.
No, that's the point,
Staples replied, his voice suddenly animated. They couch everything in complex language so that the true meaning is hidden. There was talk of this a few months ago, he said, but the rumours I heard were that it had gone far beyond being just a dispute. Really? Geneva clutched the phone tightly to her ear, looked up, and saw D.C. Jennings come in, scan the room, and make his way towards her. Yes, as I was saying, there were rumours that... A shadow fell over her. She glanced up to see Jennings standing beside her, out of breath and gesturing impatiently. "Just a moment," she told Staples. "What is it?" "I've got an address for the caretaker," Jennings said, trying to contain his excitement. She picked up the phone. "Mr. Staples, I'm really sorry, but can I call you back? Something's just come up." The Westbourne Park estate looked like yesterday's vision of the future, a future that had never arrived. Long, dark and relentless, the windows like gouges in its black armature, it projected an overwhelming sense of enclosure and monochrome, a garrisoned claustrophobia Geneva felt deep in her bones. It could have been some turreted hell prison from Mars, a place on the liminal edge of human existence. But it was right here, only a few minutes' walk from the pet clothing boutiques and designer chocolate emporiums of Notting Hill. Inside, it was even worse. The estate was a labyrinth of shadowed corridors and locked doors, a suffocating human density stacked one on top of the other. Geneva and Jennings entered the courtyard, the sun immediately snuffed out behind the ridge of roofs from the surrounding flats. The snow covered the bare asphalt and the tops of the broken swings and abandoned roundabouts, but it could do nothing to hide the patina of neglect and careless ruin. Graffiti had sprung up like some baleful flower, splashed and spangled across walls and doors and staircases, most of it impenetrable as Arabic or Burmese script, and yet just as lovely. But Geneva had noticed a worrying new trend recently, angry political slogans replacing taggers' names and lovelorn dedications. Imprecations to kill the pigs, smash the system, arm the homeless. Jennings tried to read the posted directions through the dense hatchwork of squiggles and illegible scrawls. "Flat 134. He pointed uncertainly to the far corner of the quadrangle one floor up. Geneva was surprised by how nervous he seemed, almost disappearing inside his terrible suit. Fieldwork was not his strong point, and she had often wondered how he could bear it, stuck in an office and never directly in contact with the world he was investigating. For her, the field had always been the one place where she could totally lose herself, where the spinning noise of days quietened to one whisper, and anything could happen. "We should have just got the uniforms to pick him up," Jennings complained as they crossed the courtyard and ducked under the overhanging walkways. "It's better this way," Geneva said, remembering how Carrigan had taught her that one of the most invaluable sources of evidence at their disposal was a subject's flat, what they chose to show of themselves to the world. "At least, that's what the boss says." Jennings sniffed and coughed and stopped. "Funny you should say that. I was going to ask you about him." His smile was lopsided and shaded as he said this. "You have any idea what's up with him recently?" "What do you mean?" Geneva turned to look at Jennings, and he quickly looked away. "He seems wound up very tight. I mean, more than usual." A small, nervous laugh escaped his mouth. "Carson said he gets like this every Christmas. Said it was because—" Geneva shot Jennings a cold, hard stare. "I'd focus on what we're here to do if I were you, and worry a little less about other people." She saw his face drop and felt bad for snapping at him. She knew it wasn't Jennings she was mad at, and wasn't there also a little truth to what he was saying? There was something different about Carrigan recently, a slight but unmistakable tension that was always present, as if his skin had shrunk in the wash. But it was his life, and he would tell her if he chose to. You couldn't force confidences. She knew that only too well,
thinking back to Oliver's relentless probing of her every thought and fleeting whim, his need to know everything, erasing the walls of privacy she had spent so long erecting around herself. They walked silently under the parapets, the net-curtained windows on either side twitching and shifting as if disturbed by their very passing, and came to a sudden stop a few feet from the stairwell. A group of kids stood in a circle huddled around the stairs. Loud music, seemingly consisting only of bass thumps and ground tremors, emanated from a chunky boom box perched on the second step. The kids ranged in age between 12 and 15, were mixed in race and gender, and glared at them with a uniform hostility as they approached. There was no fear in their eyes, just a simmering discontent. They were passing around a reefer, and the smell was rich and pungent in Geneva's nostrils, a smell that reminded her of her mother more than anything else. She saw one of the kids, the leader presumably, corn-rowed hair and track lines, turning up the volume until she could feel her organs begin to vibrate. She stood and eyeballed him until finally the cornrow kid broke her stare and spat on the floor an inch away from her shoe. She turned, seeing Jennings totally pale, eyes like rabbits, and pushed her way past the kids and up the stairs. Geneva knocked on the door to Alan Hubbard's flat and waited. She could hear the music from the boombox downstairs, the screams of neighbouring TV sets competing in the gauzy air, words and accusations bouncing across the concrete parapets and drowning flat in the snow. She knocked again, this time harder, looking at Jennings, wondering if he'd fucked up, got the wrong address, when she heard the sound of breaking glass coming from within. She immediately had her baton out and ready. She knocked again, stopping when she heard footsteps, each one getting a little louder, approaching the door. "He might have a broken bottle in his hand, so be careful," she warned Jennings as they took positions on either side of the door. She heard the sound of unlatching locks and ratcheting tumblers and tensed herself. Alan Hubbard was not holding a broken bottle or a knife or anything else. He looked as if he didn't have the strength to hold a packet of cigarettes. It took a moment for his eyes to focus and for him to look up, but when he saw Geneva's outstretched hand brandishing her warrant card, he reacted with the alacrity of a hyena, instantly dropping his shoulders, his whole body turning in on itself as his eyes scoured the ground. "Mr. Hubbard?" The man in front of them let out a deep sigh.
"I know why you're here,"
he said.
"I know why you've come."
Geneva thought she was going to gag the moment she entered the flat. She had smelled enough bodies, blood and rot, but this smell was something else. It was almost tangible, the air thick and hot in the cramped one-bedroom flat. Onions, sour milk, old laundry and bad breath mixed with a sickly sweet dash of booze. She concentrated on breathing through her mouth as they followed Hubbard through a small hallway and into an equally small living room. The floor was covered in yellow lino, which had peeled and cracked at several points, revealing the rough wooden underlay. Empty bottles of booze lay scattered across the flat, and a bin had overflowed, rubbish spilling out of its top like cascading lava. Airbrushed paintings of horses dotted the walls, horses nuzzling each other in lush green meadows, cantering across a prairie, or in close-up, flared nostrils and gentle eyes staring sadly into the smudged horizon. A TV was on, broadcasting shaky handheld images of civil war, dust and explosions and running journalists. Piles of old newspapers lay stacked around the room in various stages of decomposition. There was a shelf filled with 40 or 50 half-empty pill bottles and several umbrellas, the skin torn and frayed, silver fingers bent and poking through. Framed portraits of the Queen were hanging on 3 of the walls, as if she were a dictator or a saint. Hubbard sank into a grey armchair and reached for a grimy bottle of scotch that lay by his feet. Geneva could see the greasy ghost mark of his lips on the neck of the bottle, overlapped and smudged like a set of fingerprints. He took a long pull, then put it back down and sat mutely staring at his hands. She'd initially thought he was an old man,
but he wasn't even middle-aged. His youth lost behind a patchy ginger beard, sunken cheeks and red-rimmed eyes. He wore a grey T-shirt with sweat stains under the arms and smears of crusted food across the belly, and a pair of ill-fitting jeans bagged in a tight concertina around his waist. "It's all my fault," Hubbard said, finally looking up at her. "All my fault. All my fault. All my fault," he repeated, banging his fists against his thighs in time with the words. Geneva told him to stand up. She took a step back as he did so, the stench of unwashed clothes and night sweats making her feel dizzy. And it was then that Hubbard lunged forward and grabbed her arm, moving much faster than she'd thought possible. His fingers felt cold and wet against her skin. His face was a few inches away from hers, and she could see his missing teeth and black gums as he spoke. "You have to believe me." His grip kept getting tighter with each word, and then, before she realised what he was doing, he leaned in closer, his body pressing hard against hers, and whispered in her ear. Jennings had stepped forward, baton out, but Geneva nodded him away, gently put one hand on Hubbard's wrist, looked him in the eyes, and pulled her other hand free. She brushed her sleeve and turned to see Jennings, pale and bug-eyed, looking as awkward holding the truncheon as a dog playing the trumpet. She shrugged a silent message at him and turned back to the caretaker. "Could you please repeat what you just told me, Mr. Hubbard?" Hubbard looked at Jennings, then at Geneva, his eyes pale and runny, his voice a thin, scratchy wheeze. "I did it," he said, putting his arms out, palms up. "I killed them. I killed them all." Chapter 10. The coffee was strong and made him feel human again. He slowly savoured it, watching the snow spiralling outside the cafe's windows as light jazz played over the house stereo. He thought it might be Wes Montgomery, but it had been so long since he'd listened to music that he wasn't sure. He often came here when he felt the need to escape the clang and clamour of the station. The cafe had comfortable sofas, halfway decent espresso, and staff who never cleared his cup before he was finished. There was half an hour to go until his appointment with the pathologist, and he needed the food and drink to fortify himself for what would be waiting down in the morgue. The sickly smells combining with the pathologist's scratchy smoker's whisper, the cloying scent of her hairspray, and constant barrage of jokes at his expense. He took another sip and stared up at the queue. Today, the cafe was crowded with Christmas shoppers taking a break from the relentless burden of choices on the high street. Everyone seemed faintly aglow with seasonal expectation. Strangers began conversations about the snow while waiting for their drinks, but no one spoke to him. They could see the dark shadows flickering behind his eyes and sensed that he was immersed in his own separate world, and that it was a world of which they wanted no part. He finished his sandwich and tried calling Geneva, but there was no reply. He detailed her with finding the caretaker's whereabouts and wanted to know if she'd got anywhere. He took out his policy book and started to jot down the things he had just learned at the scene. The scattered rosary beads, the scratches on the confession booth door, the way the pricket stand had been moved. He didn't like what they were finding out at all. The faint hope that it had been an accident was being chipped away with each new piece of information. None of it made sense, no matter how hard he stared at it. He flipped the notebook shut and checked his watch. 15 minutes to kill. He thought of Karen then, the nurse he had met only yesterday, and how her expression seemed to reflect his own wheeling doubts and dreams. The way her smile ignited her eyes, her two front teeth emerging behind rosy lips, how it made her look sad and serious at the same time. He took out his phone and stared at it, wondering if it was too soon to call. He'd never been very good at these things. He looked up at the whirling sky outside, the buses going by, their windows fogged and streaked, the cars sporting strange toupees of snow on their roofs, then turned back and pulled the card out of his wallet. He dialed the number before he could change his mind. She answered on the second ring.
Hello?
He almost snapped the phone shut, the blood beating in his veins, but there was something calming about her voice, the swirl of her accent more pronounced than when he'd spoken to her the day before.
This is Jack Carrigan, he said, clearing his throat. My mother, Margaret
Hi, Jack. Karen interrupted, her voice soft and sultry as it crackled through his earpiece.
I was just wondering if there were any new developments.
I'm glad you called, the nurse replied. She's much better. The hip seems to be settling, and we've sedated her for the pain. There was a pause, and he thought he could hear faint moaning on the other end of the line. I was going to ask, the nurse continued, maybe if you were coming in to see her, we could have a drink or something? He looked down at the remains of his coffee and thought about the case, the long, relentless hours ahead.
I'm sorry, he said. This week's going to be tough.
I understand, she replied, her voice subdued and hard to read. Carrigan watched the falling snow outside, the crush and bustle of shoppers and neon stutter of Christmas lights arched across the high street like the gateway to some imperial corridor. He was about to ask her if they could rearrange, but by then she had already hung up the phone. He stood outside the pathologist's office and wiped down his jacket and boots. The snow was falling pure and white, but it turned to slush almost instantly on the grey pavements of Bayswater. He waited in the reception area for the pathologist to come and get him. He found that, despite himself, he was looking forward to the old woman's abrasive manner and dry humour.
Mr. Carrigan.
Jack looked up and saw a burly, barrel-shaped man approaching him. The man was shaking his head and muttering to himself. He had long salt and pepper hair, uncombed and wild, and a bushy black beard.
It's Detective Inspector, Carrigan replied as he stood up. I have an appointment with the pathologist.
I'm Milan,
the man said, not offering his hand nor any shred of comfort in his voice, which was strangely accented, a dry obduracy to it, as if each word was something to be wrestled then spat out.
And the pathologist? Where is she?
But Milan had already turned his back and was striding down a long, narrow corridor towards the doors which led to the morgue. Carrigan had little choice but to follow him. He descended the stairs and blinked to adjust his eyes. The brightness of the basement always assailed him, the stuttering lights and reflective marble floors proving a potent combination. He put on a pair of blue plastic booties, studying Milan, who was impatiently tapping his foot while humming something low and dolorous under his breath. Despite his initial impression, Carrigan realised that under the faded deep purple T-shirt and long hair, Milan was in his late 40s. Jack noted that his skin cragged and wrinkled like the flesh of a walnut. His eyes sunk deep into folded pockets of skin, as if they'd already seen too much of the world and didn't want to see any more.
Is the pathologist coming?
Carrigan was starting to feel a prickle of annoyance. He didn't want to be wasting time if the old woman wasn't here. There were too many things to do, too many leads to chase up, and he recognised that peculiar mix of adrenaline and despair that often greeted him at the beginning of a major case. Milan shrugged and used a scrunchie to tie his hair back into a ponytail, the deep purple T-shirt riding high above his gut.
She's not here.
I can see that. Where is she?
She's dead.
Carrigan stopped in his tracks, unsure if he'd somehow misheard the man through his mangled accent. Dead?
Yes, dead. You know, like all these people here.
Milan swept his arm across the room, the sheet-covered mounds on the metal tables eerie and still. Carrigan took a moment to digest this information. When was the last time he'd spoken to the old woman? A week ago? A month?
He remembered her Thatcher hairdo and the constant stink of smoke on her breath, but not her first name. The cigarettes?
No,
Milan replied.
She walked into a bus last week. Double-decker, squashed flat. No chance.
Jesus. Carrigan exhaled. Who's in charge, then?
What? You haven't worked that out. Some detective you are.
Milan turned and headed towards the centre of the room. He wrote something down on a clipboard.
So, what do you want?
Carrigan stared at the floor, trying to make sense of it. I came to get an initial report on the bodies recovered from the convent. Milan sighed and scratched his belly.
I told your boss this would take at least a week. You think I'm some kind of magician?
He pointed to the metal gurneys surrounding them. Normally the pathologists worked on 2 or 3 bodies at a time, but as Carrigan surveyed the room, he could see gurneys pressed tight against each other wherever he looked, the whole room covered in a sea of shrouded bodies. Dull metal scales hung from various points along the ceiling. Each held a mass of red or grey matter, kidneys and livers and hearts, waiting to be bagged and weighed. I was just hoping to get your initial impressions.
Initial impressions?
Milan repeated.
My initial impression is that you're nuts.
Carrigan didn't know what to say. So unexpected was the man's response, and so different from what he was used to with the old woman. Please?
Okay.
Milan finally allowed.
I look at them. I see some things, yes. But remember, this is only, what you call it, initial impression. Might be all wrong. You then come back and say, Milan fucked the case, gave us wrong results, am I right?
Milan clicked his teeth and shook his head. He walked up to the nearest gurney and unceremoniously yanked the sheet, as if he were a tired maid at the end of her shift. Carrigan took a step back. The smell was so strong and rich, so familiar.
Smell like barbecue, right?
Milan smiled, and Jack could tell he was enjoying this.
Like barbecue I used to do with my father back in the old country. But that shouldn't surprise you, Detective Inspector. What are we? Just meat on the bone? No different from a leg of pork or rack of ribs, right?
Carrigan tried to tune out the pathologist's words as he stared down at the shriveled and blackened remains of Corpse 1. The 11 bodies had all been tagged numerically, starting at the head of the table and progressing clockwise. Corpse 11 was the one they had found downstairs, cowering in the confession booth. Carrigan hated the anonymity of it. This last reduction into a single cipher, and knew that finding their identities so that they could be properly buried would be his first priority. Milan crossed to another gurney and stripped the sheet. He did this until all the bodies were uncovered. Small black lumps, more like children than adults. Medical assistants walked past, bagging samples and clearing the mess. Milan berated and shouted at them at every opportunity. They seemed shell-shocked by the new order in the morgue.
This,
Milan pointed to Corpse 1.
You should not think they curled up like this to protect themselves. This is fire. This is what happens. The muscles lose liquid and contract. The body ends up looking like it struggled and fought. But this all happens after they die. You understand?
It was basic forensics, something every detective, whether they liked it or not, quickly became familiar with, but Carrigan saw no gain in antagonizing the new pathologist.
The bodies are in very bad condition, burned for a long time. We couldn't get any fingerprints off them and dental work for only a few.
Do you have any previous experience with this kind of thing? Carrigan asked softly. Milan eyed him carefully, looking for the slight behind the words.
Believe me, you don't want to know,
he replied.
War has a way of making you into a very good pathologist.
Which side?
The side that wasn't trying to kill me.
Carrigan shrugged, wishing he hadn't brought the subject up. What about DNA?
I managed to scrape some samples, but the tissue is very degraded. I don't know if we'll be able to get much from it.
Carrigan thought about this. Prioritise Corpse 11. Have her DNA checked before the others. He knew it was imperative that they get an ID on the 11th victim as soon as possible. Without knowing who she was, they were flailing around in the dark. Milan nodded and rubbed his small, plump fingers across his shirt. Did you notice anything different about her? The corpse from the confession booth? Milan thought for a minute, checking something on his clipboard.
Yes, I thought you would ask that.
Carrigan waited for the pathologist to continue, but he didn't say anything else. What was different about her? He saw Milan smile, then quickly hide it, and he got the impression that he'd just passed some small but significant test. He watched as Milan went over to one of the gurneys and delicately turned the skull towards him.
Major blunt force trauma.
Milan pointed to a shallow declivity at the front of the skull.
She was hit hard, before the fire.
Carrigan thought of the body crumpled inside the confession booth, the fire investigator's description of the woman's final agonies. Could she have fallen forward? Hit her head against the booth door?
Maybe, but probably not. She was hit with a lot of force. It would be very hard to do that to yourself. The blow would have rendered her unconscious.
Carrigan flashed back to the serrated scratch marks on the inside of the confession booth's door. She was awake when the fire reached her.
Interesting,
Milan replied.
It's possible she came to, but after such a blow, she would have been very confused and disoriented.
What about the others?
I haven't had much of a chance to examine them yet. I have 10 more female bodies. They range in age from early 20s to late 70s. That's more or less all I can tell you right now.
Carrigan nodded, knowing this had been a waste of time. He'd been too impatient and should have waited for the full report tomorrow. He thought about the neat pattern of bodies, the way the nuns had stoically faced death at the dining room table. Anything to indicate that they were killed before the smoke got to them? Milan shrugged.
Hard to say till I open them up. No external signs, like on Corpse 11, but the fire didn't leave us much to work with. Why? You think someone killed them, then set the fire to cover it up? Amateur hour?
Carrigan was about to say that most criminals did not have a grounding in pathology and therefore made those kinds of mistakes regularly. But Milan had turned his back to him and was washing his hands in the sink. He came back, pulling a green tubular packet from his top pocket. Carrigan watched queasily as Milan unsheathed the salami from its packaging and bit off a massive chunk. Are there any indications they'd been tied up?
Well, I could find nothing that would suggest that.
Milan spoke with his mouth full, making it even harder to understand what he was saying.
But the fire...
He held up his hands.
Who knows what it erased?
So, apart from the body downstairs, nothing struck you as suspicious? Carrigan said irritably, thinking this was the least informative post-mortem chat he had ever experienced. Milan shrugged.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it has nothing to do with the case.
Let me be the judge of that.
Okay, but this is old, maybe 30, 40 years.
Milan finished his salami, burped, and snapped on his latex gloves. He walked Carrigan over to a group of gurneys crowded into the far corner.
The skin on Corpse 1's legs has been totally burned off by the fire. Otherwise, I wouldn't have noticed it.
Noticed what? Carrigan leaned closer, but could see nothing unusual.
There are several unusual injuries on the shins of the corpse.
What kind of injuries?
Striations on the bone.
Any chance these are related to their deaths? Milan shook his head.
No. These are very old. You can tell from the way the cartilage has healed around it. Good, but not perfect. So, I think to myself, this is strange. But maybe she had some freak accident when she was young. These things happen all the time, okay? But still, I decide to check the others. Just the shin bones. And yes, I'm thinking this is just some childhood accident. But then I get to corpse 4, corpse 6, 9, and 10, and I see similar marks.
Can you show me? Milan pointed with a penlight at the legs of the first corpse, and Carrigan could see the black, blistered surface like something left in the oven for too long. The pathologist delicately pulled away a loose flap of skin to reveal the congealed mass of rendered tissue below. What am I supposed to be looking at? Milan switched on an overhead spotlight and angled it in. The light was harsh and unremitting, and Carrigan saw the obscene white glint of bone, and he wanted to turn away, but forced himself to look closer. And then he saw what the pathologist had meant. There were several vertical lines running up and down the shin bone. They were rough and uneven, overlapping each other, and were about 1/2 centimetre deep. The pathologist led Carrigan to the adjacent table, corpse 4, and aimed the spotlight down into the mess of bone and burnt sinew.
See? Almost the same injuries. 1, yes, could be an accident, something like that. But 5 would be very big odds, the kind of odds you win lotteries off.
And these are also old injuries. Carrigan stared at the small bones, marked and lined with ancient wounds, and felt a shiver run down the back of his neck.
Yes, very old. Exactly the same as on corpse 1. Same thing on the others.
Any idea what could have caused them? Milan shrugged.
They're not accidental, that's obvious. So, something very sharp and fine was used to make these, and it would have hurt a lot.
Could it be self-inflicted? Carrigan asked. Some kind of self-punishment? Milan laughed.
Oh, no, Mr. Carrigan, I very much doubt it. These nuns were tortured, and by someone who knew exactly what they were doing.
Chapter 11. Geneva put Hubbard in interview room number 2 and tried to reach Carrigan and Carlson, but neither was answering his phone. She stood and stared at the water cooler as it dispensed 2 cups, weighing it up. You had to take confessions when they were offered. People quickly lost the desire to talk once they had been sitting in a police station for a few hours. With the other 2 gone, she was now the highest-ranking officer in the team. Would you like some water? She handed Hubbard one of the plastic cups and closed the door to the interview room behind her. Hubbard waved it away.
I don't want to drink. I want to confess.
She sat down, called for Jennings, and took out her notebook. She turned towards the far wall and started the digital recorder. Hubbard had waived his right to have a lawyer present, but Geneva made sure she followed procedure. If Hubbard was about to confess, she didn't want some oversight on her part getting the confession thrown out of court. She stated the date and location. D.S. Miller and D.C. Jennings present. The subject is named Alan Hubbard and has come in of his own volition. She heard a weird snuffling sound and looked up. Hubbard had slumped down onto the table, his head cradled in his folded arms.
I'm to blame,
he said, his voice muffled and distant, more like an echo than an actual voice. His smell permeated the room, meaty and sour and close. It was obvious that he had been drinking, and that he had been doing it for the last couple of days, but under the bulb flicker and whirring tapes he seemed strangely sober and lucid.
I was supposed to do it last week. Fuck.
He slammed one fist down onto his thigh.
Fuck.
What were you supposed to do? Geneva moved her chair closer, spreading her arms across the table and settling her head down to his level. There was a strategy and gameplay to every interview, and each one required a totally different approach. You had to anticipate, psychoanalyze, and go with the beat of the moment. Hubbard continued pounding his legs in staggered bursts.
I was lazy. Always lazy. Sister Jackie made it clear that I should do it before Christmas. I was going to do it, I swear. I just lost track of the days.
What is it that you didn't do, Alan? Geneva said, starting to have a bad feeling about this.
They told me the boiler cover needed fixing. They didn't say do it now, but they never say do it now. That's not how they are. The boiler blew because the cover hadn't been fixed. The boiler blew, and now they're all dead.
Hubbard started crying, small racked sobs emerging from the depths of his throat. Geneva looked at Jennings and saw her own thoughts and doubts mirrored in his eyes. She turned back to the table. Mr. Hubbard, we've had the report back from the fire investigator. You'll be happy to know that the fire did not start anywhere near the boiler. It had been in the summary she'd read, one of the first things any investigator would look for. It's not your fault.
How can they know that? Hubbard said. How can they know what happened when only God can know that?
They've looked at the evidence left from the fire.
But they weren't there. How can they know when they weren't there?
She was about to say something, then stopped. There was nothing to say. Evidence and fact were nothing compared to this man's guilt and need for recompense. She thought about what she had seen in Hubbard's flat. The gaunt grey pallor of his skin. When did you contract HIV? Geneva asked quietly. Jennings' head shot up from his notebook and he gave her a startled look.
How?
Hubbard used one of Geneva's tissues to wipe his nose and beard.
How did you...
I saw your pills, Mr. Hubbard. The man stared at the wall and sighed.
A long time ago, he said, his voice shifting down a pitch. I was backpacking through Russia. Got drunk one night and woke up in a prison cell. 2 years later, they let me out.
He looked down at his crumpled shoes, the stitching unseamed and the leather curling up at the toes.
I didn't know at the time, but they gave me this souvenir to take home with me.
I'm very sorry, Geneva said. Hubbard sniffed.
Most people thought I got what I deserved. Me, I knew I'd got what I deserved. The things I'd done. God, I wish I could forget my life.
His head jerked up and his eyes met hers.
Do you ever feel like that?
Geneva was about to say no, then stopped to think about it and nodded, sensing something small and important pass between the two of them. Was that how you met the nuns? Through the outreach work they did?
No, Hubbard replied. I was looking for work. I just knocked on doors, that's what I did. I knocked on their door. Had no idea it was a convent. Must have been the 40th door I'd knocked on that day. When Sister Jackie opened it, I didn't know what to say. I must have stood there looking like an idiot. Finally, I snapped out of it and told her I'd fixed the front gate. The latch had been wonky, and that, if they needed, I could fix other things around the house and grounds.
Hubbard stopped and looked at the blank surface of the table, his mouth pursed tight.
She was so kind, Sister Jackie. She took me to the kitchen, sat me down, gave me a cup of tea, then made me lunch. Scrambled eggs, toast and bacon. She said yes, quite a few things around the place had fallen into disrepair and that she would need to clear it with the Mother Superior, but she was sure they could find work for me. I came in twice a week after that. Sister Jackie or Mother Angelica would give me lunch, then a list of things that needed to be done. There wasn't much. I think sometimes they even made things up or put things out of joint so that I'd have work to do. They gave me food to take home. They helped me find temporary accommodation. And what did I do? I killed them. Like everything else I've ever done in my life, I fucked it up.
He huddled into himself, his breath raspy and strained, his curled fists pressing down into his legs. You mentioned 2 nuns, a Sister Jackie and Mother Angelica. Were those the only 2 you met? Hubbard shook his head.
Those are the ones I dealt with most of the time.
Could you tell us a little about Mother Angelica? While Geneva had been disappointed that Hubbard did not seem to be the arsonist, her daydream of calling Carrigan and telling him she had wrapped up the case dashed, she now realised he could be a valuable source of information. Hubbard's face darkened, and a muscle on his left cheek started twitching.
I don't think she ever liked me, he replied, but she tried to hide it. She was different from Sister Jackie and the other nuns I met, as if she were floating an inch above the ground and everyone else a prisoner of gravity. She was an old woman, and she'd been through a lot. You could tell by looking at her face, the way she conducted herself, how she never wasted a single word. She wore these tight, round glasses that made her look like an owl.
Hubbard smiled to himself, and Geneva caught a brief glimpse of the man he had been before life had hiccuped and sent him on a different track.
Me and Sister Jackie used to call her the Owl. It was our private joke. Sister Jackie told me that she had written an important book many years ago, that they all looked up to her, and that I shouldn't judge the owl by appearances.
Geneva glanced up from her notes. You must have got to know the convent's routines pretty well. You didn't by any chance notice anything unusual during the last month or so? Hubbard's eyes looked anywhere but in her direction.
Why are you asking me all these questions? Why don't you just arrest me?
We'll get to that soon enough, Geneva said. But I know you know more than you've told me. You think it's your fault that the nuns died, despite what the fire inspector found. OK, I understand that. But someone killed those nuns intentionally, and I'm going to find out who it was. You can help me, Mr. Hubbard, and you can help the nuns too by telling me what you know. Hubbard took a deep breath and slowly unclenched his fisted hands, laying them flat across the top of his thighs.
My flowers, he replied. Someone kept treading on my flowers.
That's not what we meant, Jennings said irritably. This is a murder inquiry, and we were looking for something a bit more— Where exactly were your flowers? Geneva interrupted, the edges of her fingers tingling.
In the garden, up against the back fence.
She considered this for a moment as she took a sip of water. Did you notice if the damage was worse nearer the fence or further away from it? Hubbard looked confused by this line of questioning, and she could see him straining to remember.
Right next to the fence, about halfway across. That's where they were trampled the most.
Geneva thought back to her quick perusal of the convent blueprints. There was a large garden at the back of the house. She tried to remember what was on the other side of it. More houses, another street, but it was a blank. Was that the only unusual thing you noticed recently? Hubbard shook his head, then looked down at the table. It's okay, Mr. Hubbard. Whatever you say won't go further than this room. You want us to catch whoever did this, right? Her voice softened and slowed. Everyone's dead. You're the only person who can tell us what went on in there, what could have led to this.
It wasn't the same, he whispered.
What wasn't?
The mood in the convent, Hubbard said. Everyone seemed in a bad temper all the time. Even Sister Jackie, who was never like that. They rushed down the corridors and didn't see me. Doors that were always open now remained shut. Often the basement was locked and I couldn't get to my tools. They began to talk in whispers in corners and alcoves, their faces shaded and suspicious as if they didn't trust each other anymore.
Geneva was writing this down so fast the sides of her fingers were turning a bright red. Do you have any idea what brought on these changes?
I don't know. But it started shortly after the new girl first appeared.
Hubbard replied, something in his dead grey eyes flickering to life for a brief bright moment. New girl? Geneva and Jennings said at the same time.
I first saw her about a year ago, and then I kept seeing her more and more. She was often with the owl, both of them talking, looking serious, their heads bent down over some book or other. She always smiled when she passed me in the corridor. She was very pretty.
Hubbard blushed, and Geneva could tell he was a little in love with this girl. An anonymous yearning played out in snatched looks and chance encounters. Do you know her name? Hubbard shook his head. Was it possible she was in training? A novice, perhaps? Hubbard seemed to find this mildly amusing, smiling out the corner of his mouth.
She definitely wasn't a nun.
Why do you say that?
The things she wore. Ripped jeans, baggy T-shirts, big chunky black boots. But the funniest thing was her hair.
Her hair?
She had pink hair. Pink panther pink. It looked so out of place among the nuns with their wimples and habits.
When was the last time you saw her? Hubbard closed his eyes for a moment.
A couple of weeks ago, he replied. The same day the visitors came.
Visitors? Geneva said, slightly out of breath.
I only saw them briefly, but I'd never seen them before.
What did they look like? Men? Women? Priests?
2 men. Foreign they were. Dark-skinned but not black. Wore suits, looked like expensive suits. They were talking to Mother Angelica, arguing really, then shouting. Finally, Mother Angelica told them to leave.
Hubbard looked up at Geneva.
Mother Angelica was shaking with anger. I'd never seen her like that before.
Did the men say anything?
Hubbard sniffled and coughed into his fist. Only that they would be back.
Chapter 12. She was about to call it a night. She had written up her notes from the interview and was looking forward to the prospect of a slow, strong drink, the lights down low and the curtains pulled tight against the day. But something kept nagging at her. She read through the interview summary again, and it didn't take her long to work out what it was. She managed to grab a sandwich at the canteen, but she ate it too fast, and she made her way through the tightly packed crowds of Queensway. Her jacket wasn't warm enough, and the snow was working its way under her collar, causing wet trickles to run down the back of her neck. But she didn't care at all. She tilted her head and let the snow fall on her face, enjoying the icy, slapping sting of it. She'd always loved the blank mystery of snow, from that first remembered Easter in the Baltic to the crisp white fields of wintertime Colorado, where she and Oliver had spent their Christmas holidays. The thought of her ex-husband came up like the bile in her stomach. She'd finally opened the letters, listened to the answering machine messages with their threats, insinuations and promises of lengthy litigation, and knew she would have to meet him face to face so that she could end this part of her life once and for all. She couldn't bear the thought of it, but she needed the money he owed her, was sick of borrowing from her mother at the end of each month. She wished she could take Carrigan with her. There was something about him,
a sense of comfort and protection, but she quickly dismissed the idea, embarrassed for even having thought it. She turned into St. Peter's Square, the scent of scorched wood still suspended in the air as if trapped by the snow. The scene was as she remembered, and yet it was also different. The eager, jostling crowds of the first night had thinned, so that now only a few stray shoppers stumbled on this ruined skeleton of a house, staring up for a few moments, then turning back into the chaos and noise of the high street. The blue crime scene tape had been moved, and it now covered a much smaller area, as if the crime itself was receding from memory. Geneva thought about what Hubbard had said about his flower beds, and the girl with the pink hair, wondering if she was another of the nuns' projects, their lost sheep, as Holden had called them. She pulled out the map Hubbard had drawn for her during the interview, shielding it from the falling snow. She tried to imagine the house before the fire, the front garden all neat and tidy, the light leaking from arched windows and falling softly on the grained floor as the nuns sat and knelt and meditated on fate and suffering. But she didn't stand there long. She checked Hubbard's sketch again and walked past the house. The firemen had got there in time to save the building next door. She could see blurry lights behind pulled curtains and the flicker dance of shadows moving within. There were 2 houses to the left of the convent, and then the square ended. She checked the map and turned down the narrow side street. A high brick fence enclosed the terrace and ran the length of the back gardens. She followed it until the wall curved back round into a small alley. The snow was as smooth as a well-made bed, and her footsteps were the first to mark its surface as she cautiously entered. The alley was about 15 feet wide, with tall wooden fences on either side, and was lit only by the weak-spilt light from the surrounding residences. Geneva walked slowly, her feet unsteady in the deep snow. She could see the roofs of the houses above the fence line and made her way towards the convent. She stared up at the ruined structure as it glowed darkly against the sky. Then she looked down. The snow next to the fence was unbroken. No one had been here today. She pulled out the map Hubbard had made and tried to work out where the flower beds were. The fence was about 20 feet long and 8 feet high. The top of the fence was crowned in snow, and she was unable to see if there were any scratches, tears, or other evidence that it had been climbed. Small bushes and scraggly weeds covered the ground directly in front of it, rising several feet above the snow line. She gently kicked away the loose powder with her boots. She looked up as a light went on in one of the neighbouring houses, then blinked off. She knelt down and carefully scooped away the remaining snow with her hands until she had revealed the rough asphalt. A muffled sound made her turn round, almost losing her balance, but when she looked behind her, the alley was empty. She took a deep breath and brushed some more of the snow away from the bottom of the fence. She aimed her torch into the newly cleared space and noticed something shining on the ground. By the base of the bush, there was a collection of random litter. Crushed cigarette butts, chocolate wrappers, dead leaves, and several small squares of silver foil. Each one had dark burn marks spreading from its centre like crushed spiders. Geneva took out an evidence bag and was reaching down when she heard the sound again. She spun round and aimed the torch in the direction of the noise. She swept it up and down the alley, but there was nothing. She waited a few seconds, listening to the roaring of the blood in her ears, and then she heard it again, a soft, mewling cry floating on the wind. "Police! Show yourself!" she shouted, her palms sweating despite the cold. There was no reply, nor repeat of the sound. She was about to turn back when she saw it coming towards her. The cat stopped and arched its back and growled at her. Its eyes were black as night, lost in ruffles of white fur, and its mouth was stretched so wide it looked as if it had been torn apart. It stood there and hissed and curled its right claw. A nervous burst of laughter shot through Geneva. "Get out of here, cat," she said, feeling embarrassed and more than a little relieved. She turned round, bagged the silver foil, then took a few steps back and studied the fence. It was made up of several sections nailed together. One of the sections, directly in front of where she had found the foil, had come loose. She leaned forward and ran her hand into the gap. The wood gave about an inch, and she heard a faint scraping and scratching coming from below. She used her fingers to follow the crack as it disappeared behind the bushes, and held her breath as she felt the sudden change in texture from the rough, splintered feel of the wood to something smooth and man-made. She dropped her torch, cursed, and picked it up again, then crouched down and pushed the shrubs aside. The fence was broken all the way to the bottom, and the lower half of the crack was held in place by 4 thick strips of grey gaffer tape. She stared at it for a long moment, and then she understood. Someone had removed the section of fence, then taped it back together so that it could be opened and closed at will. Someone had turned the broken fence into a door. D.C. Singh found her standing outside the front of the convent. "I think we may have something," Singh said, out of breath and a little ruffled. She'd been on her way to dinner when she'd got the call, and was still dressed in a tight black trouser suit, her hair straight as a ruler, and the faintest trace of makeup around her eyes. Geneva felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. How long had it been since she'd had a reason to dress up like that? "Thought you were off today." Singh frowned. "Branch came in earlier, told us all leave was suspended until this thing is solved." "Shit," Geneva said, watching her cigarette melt a tiny hole in the snow. "I guess Christmas just got cancelled," the young DC dourly replied as she pulled out a clipboard and rifled through the pages. "Haven't broken the news to Steve yet. He's going to blow his top." Geneva shrugged the kind of shrug women give each other to signify the vagaries of men. She looked across at the blackened silhouette of the convent, one wall still standing, the others in various states of collapse, and she was reminded of those paintings of ruined abbeys straddling impossible mountain peaks, the sense of longing and mystery in things no longer there. "Anything on the door-to-doors?" "Pretty much the usual crap." Singh explained that the uniforms had spent the day going up and down the street, interviewing the residents, hoping someone had seen something the night of the fire. "One woman, an old lady 2 houses across, said she saw a priest leaving the premises at about 5, gave us a description," Singh said, wrapping her jacket tightly around her as the wind came careening down from the park, icy and sharp, so cold it made their eyes water. "We also talked to the people who first called it in. They were about to have a dinner party and the husband had gone outside to smoke his pipe. This was around 6:45 by his estimate. He said at first he didn't see anything unusual, and then a few minutes later he noticed white smoke coming from the building but didn't think much of it. He was just putting out his pipe when the first flames became visible. He reckons that a pipe takes him 15 minutes to smoke, so we now have 7 p.m. as an approximate time for the fire." "For the flames," Geneva corrected, then immediately regretted it when she saw the constable's eyes drop to the ground and realised that Singh had been hoping to impress her. "Good work," she added, but she could tell it was too late. "You mentioned there was something else?" Singh nodded, hugging herself against the wind and snow. "One of the uniforms talked to a teacher at the primary school a couple of doors down from the convent. Apparently she said she had something to report, but that she was busy and he should come back in an hour." Geneva shook her head and looked down at her soaked shoes. "And he just left her there, right?" Singh shrugged her shoulders. "For God's sake, they're worse than useless, these new recruits." Like the convent, the school was housed in what had once been a residential building, and the only thing to announce this change was a small brass plaque fixed to the gate proclaiming it one of the first Montessori schools in London. It took 3 rings before the door was answered.
The woman on the other side looked put out and piqued, as if Geneva and Singh were the fifth set of salesmen calling that day. "Yes?" she said, her accent totally at odds with her looks. Geneva showed the woman her warrant card. "You told one of the constables you had some information?" The woman nodded and introduced herself as Gabby. She had long blonde hair tied back in a messy ponytail and chapped fingers. Gabby studied the warrant card carefully, then grudgingly opened the door a further few inches. "Look, I'm really busy. Couldn't you wait until I finished?" Geneva walked past her into the hallway. Bright paintings, crude diagrams, strange versions of Disney characters and third-world leaders lined the walls on either side. "We won't take up much of your time." "I've got to go through this again. Christ, I didn't even see anything important. I wish I hadn't told the officer now." The woman stood there a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe Geneva's impertinence. "You mind if we do it in there? I still have a lot of work to do." The front room had been converted into a small classroom. 12 wooden desks were aligned in precise rows, the chairs all neatly tucked beneath them. A blackboard was mounted on one wall. Posters, revolutionary slogans, and more of the children's artwork surrounding it. A large photo stretched the length of the room and depicted 2 hands, one black and one white, shaking. "You told one of the officers you saw something?" Geneva watched as the woman cleared her desk in staggers and clumps, and could tell she was one of those people, more and more of them lately, who distrusted the police instinctively as a badge of fashionable protest and self-gratifying resistance, seeing them only as jack-booted avatars of a new world order. "May have seen something," Gabby replied, as if correcting a student for her errant grammar. "Listen. We are conducting a murder inquiry, so you need to tell us anything you may have seen." "Murder?" Gabby raised a hand to her mouth. "You mean it wasn't an accident? Oh, God!" She looked down at the table, then back at the 2 detectives. "No one will know I gave you this information, right? I won't have to testify." Geneva thought she had probably watched too many American cop shows, but assured her there would be no need to testify and that this was purely for background information. Gabby stared across the classroom at a Mugabe poster splashed in red and green on the far wall. "Because the people I saw," she said, pointing to the front window. "Look, 3 gates down. That's the entrance to the convent. When I'm here teaching the girls, I can see who's coming and going." Geneva sidled up next to Gabby. From where she was standing, in front of the whiteboard, you could see the entire class, but you could also see the large Louvre window and everything that occurred within its frame. "I only noticed them because they double-parked," Gabby continued. "We've spent years fighting the council to put up signs about it. It's a narrow road, and a double-parked car is a death trap when you have so many kids running around." "Noticed what?" Geneva was becoming increasingly frustrated by the teacher's digressive burble. "It was only a couple of times. No, 3, I think. But it was the same 2 men each time. As I said, if they hadn't double-parked, I wouldn't have noticed. It's just they weren't the kind of men you expect to see in a place like that." Suddenly, Geneva's attention was entirely focused on the teacher. "What do you mean?" "You know, there's a certain type." "And what type is that?" "Black suits," Gabby replied. "Serious-looking people. One had this grotesque scar running down the side of his mouth. They didn't look like nice men." Geneva thought about what the teacher was saying and what she wasn't saying. "And you saw 2 of these types visiting the convent more than once?" "Yes, 3 times over the last month. Each time double parking and just leaving the car there, blocking the whole street." "Did you notice how long they stayed?" Gabby took a moment to think about this. "Never more than 10 minutes. A little less, actually.
I could see them better when they were walking out, when I knew they couldn't see me. They climbed into one of those black BMW monstrosities with tinted windows. An SUV? The teacher nodded. You didn't by any chance get the registration? You think I'm stupid? She replied. You think I'm going to go out there and write it down? Besides, until what happened with the fire, I really didn't think twice about it. Only remembered when your officer asked me if there'd been any unusual comings and goings. Gabby shuddered and shook her head, as if trying to rid herself of the memory. Geneva listened to the furtive scratching sound of her pen as she wrote this information down. Did you know the nuns? Did the school have any dealings with them? No, not for a while, Gabby replied. They used to come and help us put together fundraisers for the kids, but that all stopped about a year ago. That alley behind the school. Has there been any trouble there? Gabby's eyes widened briefly. We had a few problems. People dealing drugs out the back. We called you guys, and a couple of uniforms came over and had a word. The next day the dealers were back again as if nothing had happened. And it's still going on? Geneva asked, some small lever in her brain starting to trip. Gabby shook her head. The nuns put a stop to all that. Geneva's eyes flicked up from her notebook. How did they do that? A couple of them stood sentry by the mouth of the alley. They took shifts, gave out leaflets for rehab clinics, prayed and sang hymns. Guess it put off the customers, because we no longer had any trouble back there. And what about the woman with pink hair? Did you ever see anyone of that description entering the convent? Pink hair? Gabby shook her head, as if the very question didn't make sense. They left the teacher alone in her classroom and stepped out into the snow and howling wind. Singh went off to check on the uniforms as Geneva lit a cigarette, thinking that for somewhere that wasn't supposed to have any visitors, the convent was proving to be a popular place. She was about to head back to her car when she noticed the cameras. They were small, grey, and well concealed. One was aimed at the front door of the school and would be of no use, but as Geneva looked up at the camera facing the main gate and followed its trajectory, she felt a surge of excitement and smiled. Chapter 13. Branch caught him on the way to the late briefing. "A word, Carrigan," he said, disappearing into his office before Jack had a chance to reply. A TV had been recently installed on the super's wall, and muted news bulletins about the fire, European economic collapse, and a new supervirus kept flashing across the screen as Carrigan took a seat. The evening sky was white as a candle, a steady, bright smudge across the horizon, which forced him to squint as he faced Branch. "Good work, Carrigan. Good work." "Sir?" Jack shifted uneasily in his chair. He knew his boss well enough to know that Branch handing out compliments was always the precursor to something bad. "You have a suspect, I'm told. Confessed to the crime. That's splendid news." Carrigan tried to read the super's expression, but Branch was already flicking through the files on his desk. Suspect? He had no idea what Branch was talking about. "D.S. Miller's been trying to contact you." "I was at the morgue, and I had to give a deposition in court. You know that." "Well then, I've made your day." Branch looked up and smiled. "The ACC's on his way here, so it would be good if you had this suspect all packed up and ready. Quinn wants a press conference tonight to announce it. He's seen the papers and he's not happy." "The papers?" Branch shook his head despairingly and flung a copy of the Standard across the table. The front page had a colour photo of the flame-wrapped convent under the headline, "Who is the 11th victim?" George Kahn's byline appeared just beneath it. Carrigan scanned the first two paragraphs. "Christ." "Indeed," Branch murmured. In my experience, Carrigan, when people start talking to the press, it's often because the investigation is losing focus and the rank and file are questioning their superiors' handling of the case. It took Carrigan a moment to realise what Branch was saying. It could have come from any of a number of sources. Could be the pathologist's assistants, one of the firemen, could be anyone.
Well, I'm glad you're so quick to dismiss it,
Branch replied.
With Quinn looking over your shoulder, let's hope for both our sakes it is.
Carrigan waited a beat. We have some new information regarding the nuns. Carrigan told him what the pathologist had found, the marks on the shin bones of the 5 nuns, knowing it was the last thing Branch wanted to hear.
Quinn's not going to like that one bit. 40 years ago? I don't think it's wise to mention that particular bit of information when you see him.
Branch let out a dry, bitter laugh.
Jesus! Why the fuck did he have to choose you for this? You have no idea what you've got yourself into, Carrigan. You really don't want to fuck with Quinn. There's stories. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but believe me, there's stories that'll make your hair curl.
Branch paused and shook his head.
This would almost be funny if it wasn't for the fact that I'm your superior and I'll get blamed for your fuck-ups. Christ, not only does Quinn live up the road, he's also the head of the bloody Catholic Police Association.
Branch stopped suddenly, his eyes squinting. Anyway, to get back to the point, take the suspect. I don't care how strong you think the case is. Process him so that Quinn can have his press conference and leave us the fuck alone. Branch pulled out a mobile from his jacket, signalling the end of the conversation. As Carrigan was leaving, the super looked up one last time and said, "Under the fucking microscope, Carrigan, remember. Under the fucking microscope." He marched into the incident room, the door slamming shut behind him, everyone in the room raising their heads. Why the fuck wasn't I told we have a suspect? No one said a word, gazes dropping to notebooks and knees. I tried calling you, sir, several times, Geneva explained. Carrigan took the phone out of his pocket and realised he had forgotten to turn it back on after leaving court. Shit, he muttered under his breath. He looked back up at the team. So, do I have to wait till Christmas, or is someone going to tell me who this bloody suspect is? We picked up the caretaker, Alan Hubbard, Geneva replied. He said he'd killed the nuns. We interviewed him and concluded that he's not a viable suspect. And what made you conclude that, D.S. Miller? Geneva swallowed rapidly, looking down at her notes. He thinks he killed the nuns because he never got round to fixing the boiler. For a brief moment, the mood in the incident room lifted, some of the younger constables laughing and swapping incredulous looks among themselves. We're holding him downstairs as a witness for now. Jennings checked his whereabouts on the night of the 14th, and it looks like he's clear. Carrigan didn't know if this was good news or bad. He stood up and wiped the whiteboard behind him. He pinned up the photos he had taken in the chapel. The scratched door, the pricket stand, the statue of the saint. This isn't our usual case. We have 11 bodies, not one. A crime scene that's almost useless, and a public relations nightmare if we don't find out who did this. He turned around, saw the gravity of the situation sinking in, and continued. I want updates from you as soon as you have something, even if you think it's nothing. I don't want to get sandbagged by Branch like that again. Geneva pulled out her notes and told him about Hubbard's description of the new girl. She felt a small measure of satisfaction when she saw his expression. OK, we need to find out what we can about this woman. Jennings, I want you to take some uniforms and re-canvass the area. Do we have a description? Geneva shrugged. Not really, apart from the pink hair. Any other visitors? Carrigan asked,
and D.C. Singh told him about the sighting of the priest leaving the convent a couple of hours before the fire. I showed the description to Hubbard, and he recognised him immediately. Said his name was Father McCarthy and that he was a regular visitor. That bastard Holden never mentioned any priest, Carrigan said, not knowing if Holden had been evasive because he had something to hide or because it was his default position. Do we have an address for this Father McCarthy? Carlson shook his head.
I called the diocese. They confirmed that a Father Callum McCarthy worked for them, but when I asked where I could reach him, they told me he was unavailable, and then when I pressed them, they put the phone down.
They put the phone down?
They put the phone down.
Carrigan felt that familiar heat in his chest, the case finally beginning to break open, showering them with leads, anomalies, and inconsistencies. He knew that it was always somewhere in here, in the raw data sprawl of information and recalled fact, that the solution would be found. Any other visitors? Geneva told him about the double-parked SUV, the teacher's description of the two men, and the position of the school's CCTV cameras. Could be the same two that Hubbard mentioned. Berman, get hold of that footage. Let's see if we can find out more about these men. Carrigan updated the whiteboard and stood back. He could always see the case better when it was written down, each piece of information and stray fact sequestered behind neat columns. But with the convent, nothing was that simple. Usually, any anomaly in an investigation stuck out like a loose nail, but this case was proving to be so full of them that it was impossible to recognise what was genuinely pertinent. He knew it was his job to rein in the investigation and make sure they wouldn't be led into spinning black holes of mystery and dead ends. Branch's words rang sourly through his head. So, we know the convent certainly had their share of visitors, but we don't know if this means anything yet. There's more, Geneva interrupted. More? Carrigan frowned and ran his fingers through his beard as Geneva explained about the jury-rigged fence at the back of the convent. Looks like some junkies were using it regularly to fix. There were rumours someone was dealing out of that alley. The local station dispatched some uniforms a few months back, but apparently that didn't help, so the nuns decided to take things into their own hands. Stood there all day, handing out leaflets for rehab clinics. I sent the Soccos to have a look, but with the snow washing everything away, I'm not confident we'll get much in terms of evidence. I think we should have a uniform posted there in case anyone returns. Carrigan, lost in swirls of thought, his voice strangely disembodied when he finally spoke. I don't think that's relevant to the fire, and we're stretched way too thin as it is with all these new leads to pursue. Geneva looked down at her notes, her shoulders slumping. I disagree. The incident room was silent, everyone watching Carrigan to see how he would react, Carlson just managing to hide the smile that was creeping across his face. Carrigan stared at Geneva, then said, "What makes you think this has any relevance?" She looked surprised and took a swig of Coke to gather her thoughts together. Holden told us that the nuns had their special projects, their lost sheep, Geneva said, thinking out loud. Maybe the back garden was known as a safe place to fix, the door making it easy to slip in and out. She saw the team's expression suddenly slip into focus, a new intensity in their eyes, and continued. Let's say one of the junkies decided to go inside the convent, perhaps just wanting to get out of the cold, was staggering around, and knocked one of the candles over. What about the 11th victim? Carrigan asked, running the scenario through his mind. Maybe she was the junkie we're talking about. Or maybe she stumbled on them, tried to get them to leave, and a struggle broke out. That would explain the head wound. I wish it was that simple. Carrigan could see Geneva was upset,
But they were in a war against time and memory, and everything had to be sacrificed to the momentum of the case. It was one of the few things he believed in without reservation. Carson, talk to your sources, find out who's been fixing up in that courtyard, and see if they know anything about the door in the fence, he said, trying to placate Geneva. But the mood was sour and deflated after that. It didn't get any better when he told them about the pathologist's findings. I don't know if this has anything to do with the case, but the pathologist was pretty certain that 5 of the nuns had been tortured in an identical way. He remembered the shriveled bodies flat on their gurneys, how every life, when put under the microscope, was a collection of shadow and rumour, inconsistencies, mysteries, and petty misdemeanours. Now, this was done to them at least 30 or 40 years ago, and I don't want to waste too much time on it, but Singh and Miller, I want you to go back to the diocese and have a look through their archives. We need to know who these nuns were. Not all of them join young, remember. Some have previous lives they've run away from. We're seeing the nuns as a group now, and that's wrong. We need to see them as individuals. Carrigan looked up abruptly, his brow creasing. Jennings, can you get off the bloody phone? We're in the middle of a briefing. Jennings put his hand over the mouthpiece. It's forensics, sir. They've just processed some of the samples from the convent. Carrigan grunted an apology and continued. We don't know if the nuns were locked in or if they locked the door themselves. We need to take into account both scenarios. We also need to consider whether the 11th victim was the intended target and the nuns just collateral damage. Maybe this was a random accident, some junkie stumbling over a candle. But maybe it wasn't. The fact the fire started directly beneath the very place where the nuns had just gathered for dinner and the presence of the 11th victim make me think we're looking at something else. We need to get an ID for her. Once we know who she was and why she was there that particular night, we'll know a lot more about why the fire started. Carrigan scanned the room and saw that everyone's eyes were focused and sharp. They now had something to pursue. A promise that somewhere in the confusion of random data and rumour, a killer was hiding. He was about to dismiss them when he saw Jennings putting down the phone and signalling agitatedly with his left hand. Yes? I've just talked to forensics. And? Carrigan said impatiently. Jennings looked down at his notes. There was a funny smell in the chapel. They took some samples and tested them. Jennings hesitated, his breath short and laboured. The samples came back positive for cocaine. Chapter 14. There was nothing waiting for him at home. Sleep and rest were not to be found there. Carrigan felt frazzled and frayed, his body running on empty. Too many coffees and the long, winding rush of the day culminating in that last unexpected piece of evidence. Once he would have called his best friend Ben. Once he would have walked over to Ben's house and spent the night talking until the first faint light of morning. But Ben was in prison, and Carrigan had put him there. He'd never second-guessed or regretted his decision, and knew it had been the right one. But on a night like this, that was little comfort. So he drove. From Hammersmith to Highgate, Hackney to Hounslow, through Southfields and Mortlake, across time and space and night. 3-4 times a week, when sleep wouldn't come, he would circle the city, passing through neighbourhoods he'd never seen before and would never see again. There was something soothing about the deserted streets, muted pavements and darkened shops, the rough edges and unrealised hopes rubbed away into shadow play and night. This was the city in its most essential state, the bare blueprint on which the day's events and tragedies had yet to be written. And he often felt that the city was somehow contained in these nocturnal orbits, that as long as he kept driving, he could circumscribe the endless spill and burst of its boundaries. He crossed the wintry spine of Hyde Park, thinking about the case, the spiralling flow of new information, how everything they'd learned about the nuns in the last 48 hours seemed so at odds with their initial impressions.
The snow was coming down in heavy drifts, erasing the horizon and greater city beyond. He drove past the night dwellers huddled in narrow doorways, shivering and junk-sick on benches or sleeping in shop alcoves under cardboard blankets. When you reach this depth of weather, only those with truly nothing left and nowhere to go were still out on the streets, and Carrigan tried not to think how little there was separating them from him. He rubbed his head and blinked as the traffic lights turned to green. So much they didn't know yet. So many blank spaces on the map. The ACC calling every hour, Branch making frequent unannounced visits, the press clamouring and hectoring with every editorial. 10 days until Christmas. He kept coming back to the cocaine. He remembered the sour, stinging smell in the chapel. What was it doing there? And how significant was it? The angry honking of a cab snapped him out of his thoughts, and he was surprised to find himself gliding down Bayswater Road. Maybe it was just muscle memory, the way he'd ended up back in his own patch like a homing pigeon, but he knew it was something more than that as he turned into St. Peter's Square. He got out of the car and stretched, his shoes instantly disappearing under layers of snow. The icy chill reaching his toes gave him a welcome jolt. He ducked under the crime scene tape and looked up at the house. The moon rained light on the ruins, and the snow hid the ugly burn scars and twisted metal. But it wasn't the house he was interested in. It was what lay beneath. The fire investigator had told him the basement would be secured sometime tomorrow, and that he'd be able to inspect it then. But he couldn't wait. The unexpected findings of the Sockos and an offhand comment from the caretaker had made sure of that. He passed through the gaping doorframe and into the hallway. The smell filled his nostrils instantly. Despite the howling wind which rattled through the building, it hadn't dissipated, leaking from the wood and curled metal. The firemen had strung emergency lights across the walls. Small bulbs lay in white plastic holders, as if in imitation of fairy lights. When he pulled the switch, he was surprised to find they worked. Carrigan briefly looked up at the dining room, then headed for the basement stairs. He opened the door and saw that the fireman had strung the lights all the way down. He put his torch back in his pocket and examined the stairs. They had been charred and cracked by the fire, but the Sockos had managed to make their way up and down them without incident. The stairs wobbled as he put his weight on them, his palms curled tight around the banister, but they held, and, as he descended, he noticed that the smell had become stronger and harsher, tearing at his nasal passages, a bitter snap of taste at the back of his throat. The emergency lights emitted a foggy yellow glow, so that the basement resembled something from an old photograph, a snapshot of things long gone, drenched in sepia and dust. Carrigan's eyes slowly adjusted to the murky gloom, and he could see that he was in a large, single space demarcated by darkness and cloistered areas. There were no windows, and large arched transepts swept along the centre of the room, tapering down into plain stony columns. The basement had been used as a crypt, and 3 of the walls were lined with dusty grey tombs, each about 4 feet high. The back wall was bare, and had a table at its centre, a large 1970s piece of office retro, sturdy enough to have withstood the fire. An empty chair was tucked neatly underneath. Tall metal bookcases lined the walls to either side of the table, the paint blistered, and the shelves holding only the ashes of their former occupants. The corner area was partially walled off by linked columns, and Carrigan could see slant tools dangling from hooks and slots driven into the wall, screwdrivers and hammers and pliers of all sizes. He got to his knees and examined the floor underneath. The area looked like an overhead shot of volcanic badlands, but instead of black, the hardened lava was white and creamy. Carrigan picked up one of these strange congealed forms and saw it was composed of several different types of plastic which had melted and reconfigured on cooling. The ash was peppered with small burnished metal parts, cogs and springs and pulleys which had survived the fire. There were also a handful of motherboards and processors, scorched and cracked and useless. He made some notes, then got up and examined the tombs. They were made of granite and white stone, and the dates inscribed on their sides ranged from 1926 to 2009. There were no carved angels, comforting saints, or words of hope, only the blank hewn stone, as austere as the lives of those resting within had been. He counted 18 tombs, lined up in even rows along 3 of the walls, uniform in size and design. The marble and stone cracked and patterned with the years. He thought of the people walking by on the street outside, taking their children to school, unaware of the mute, ashy bodies beneath their feet, and it made him think of all the undiscovered corpses leaking slowly away below parks and moorland, new developments and kitchen floors. 250,000 people went missing every year in Britain. How many of them had been murdered? No one knew. The irony was that the killers they caught and locked away were the careless or stupid ones, the ones who had made mistakes. The idea of a Darwinian process of natural selection among murderers was something he didn't want to think about. He spent the next 15 minutes walking the basement, checking through each mound of ash and dust, pressing his face against the walls, looking for marks and signs, traces and anomalies. But he found nothing of interest. He came to a stop in the centre of the room and closed his eyes and tried to imagine what it had been like when it was full of people. It was a useful trick in getting an idea of what should and shouldn't be present. He imagined the nuns coming down here to pay their respects, or doing the washing, cleaning the mould from the stones, maybe using the tools he had found in the back corner. And then his eyes flicked open, and he looked at the far wall with its desk and bookcases, and then he looked at the opposite wall, a line of 3 tombs running along its length, and then back again. He scanned each wall in turn, sensing something awry, some shift of perspective. And then he went upstairs. He looked to his left, then to his right. The light was better here on the ground floor, but he was certain it was more than just that. He approached the front door, then turned and counted his steps all the way to the back door. He could hear a van or SUV parking outside, the sound of a TV from a neighbouring house, a car screaming somewhere in the night. He took less time going down the stairs, knowing which were weak and which would hold him, and when he was in the basement, he repeated the procedure again, counting steps from front to back. He did this twice to make sure he hadn't made a mistake, and then he did it once more, because it didn't make any sense. The basement was 5 paces smaller than the ground floor. He tried to think of any reason this might be, but came up with none. He looked at the workshop, then at the opposite wall. 3 tombs lined the length of it, placed head to toe, a 2-foot gap separating one from another. Carrigan ran over to the wall, almost tripping, pulling down some of the emergency lights by accident as he stumbled and righted himself. He stared at the dark, dappled surface, roamed his torch across every brick and grout, but it was nothing more than a plain brick wall. He stepped back, a little disappointed, and examined the tombs. He checked each tomb in turn, running his light down into the space where rock and wall met, and it didn't take him long to spot the fine tracery of scratches veining the floor and radiating in an arc from the far edge of the middle tomb. He thought of the pricket stand upstairs and aimed his light into the gap between the tomb and the wall, but it was too narrow to see what lay behind. He bent his knees and pressed his shoulder against the side of the tomb. He pushed, his shoes sliding on the floor, and felt the tomb give slightly. He leaned into it, encouraged, and pushed harder, certain he was about to dislocate his shoulder. The tomb shifted. He stopped, got his breath back, then, using his legs for support, he continued until one end of the tomb was several inches away from the wall.
He squeezed himself into the gap and, using this new leverage, pushed the tomb further back. The stone slid and screeched against the floor, but it was surprisingly easy, and he wondered if it had been designed expressly for this purpose. He got back to his feet and peered into the gap. This time he didn't need the torch to see that the wall wasn't brick all the way down. Concealed behind the tomb at the bottom of the wall was a small horizontal wooden door. It was flush to the floor and about 3 feet high and 5 across. At the bottom of the door there was a single ring pull made of brass. Carrigan put his torch back in his pocket, squatted down, his back tight against the cold tombstone, and pulled. Nothing. No movement at all. He curled his fingers around the ring, tensed his shoulders and pulled harder. This time there was a single muted click, and Carrigan felt a rush of stale air hit his face as the door flap swung open. Chapter 15. The traffic was backed up all the way down Vauxhall Bridge Road. Geneva was watching Singh texting in the seat next to her, the young constable's attention fixed on the small grey screen, her fingers moving in rhythmic counterpoint to her expression. Geneva couldn't begin to imagine what could be so engrossing. She turned and stared out at the snow-sculpted pavements, the shuffle of shoppers and workers sludging through the muck and slush on their way to some place better, and tried not to think of her own flat, the letters on the coffee table, and shrill demands waiting on her answering machine. Singh was still texting as Geneva parked outside the diocese's office. She had spoken to Holden after the briefing, having caught him on his way out, and he'd agreed to let her go through the archives tomorrow morning. She'd put the phone down and stared at the mountain of files on her desk, not wanting to go home, then glanced across the table at Singh and said, "You up for a late one?" Singh had nodded, and Geneva saw relief brighten the young constable's face. For Geneva, late nights had always been one of the perks of the job. The seminarian who answered the door wasn't the same young man as before, and yet there was an uncanny similarity between the two, as if they'd been sourced from the same mould. "He didn't say anything to me about this." Geneva flashed her warrant card. "I spoke to him a couple of hours ago, and he okayed it with me. You want me to go back to the station, tell a judge you're refusing us entry, and come back with a warrant?" The young man's face blanched at the word warrant, despite his best efforts to hide it. "I'm afraid Mr. Holden's gone home for the day," he said. "That's perfectly okay," Geneva replied. "It's the archives we want, not him." The young man moved back, as she'd known he would, not wanting to brush up against her as she stepped past him. She noticed his eyes linger just a little too long on her legs, and she gave him one of those smiles that always worked for her in bars. His cheeks turned a surprising shade of crimson as she held out her hand and introduced herself. "Rupert." His palm was soft and hot, and she couldn't feel any bones underneath the padded folds of skin. The archives were located in an extension of the second-floor library. Rupert led them past long tables populated by silent young men hunched over ancient handwritten books, a grim concentration on their faces, and into an annex full of rusty filing cabinets and dusty stacks of paper. The silence in the room was startling. It was as if someone had turned off the city with the ease of flicking a light switch. Geneva took out her notebook, pencils, laptop, and a can of Coke. She turned to see Rupert shaking his head, pointing to the can, then to a sign saying absolutely no food or drink. "Thanks. I think we'll be okay." Geneva waited, but Rupert didn't budge. "I'm afraid I can't leave you in her alone." He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the floor, examining his shoes as if seeing them for the very first time. "It's diocese policy." "You think we're going to steal these documents?" "I don't know what you're going to do. No man can know what another man will do." "Woman," Geneva corrected.
They went through the grey, creaky cabinets until they found the files for the convent. Geneva was disappointed by how thin they were, wondering if Holden had filleted them after receiving her phone call. She spread the files across a table which Rupert had obligingly cleared for her. She scanned the sheet Holden had given her yesterday and matched each name to a separate folder. There were 10 folders for 10 nuns. The nuns' names were Irish, English, Scottish and Spanish. Geneva gave Singh the first 5 off the top and took the rest for herself. Rupert sat perfectly still and silent as the 2 detectives spent the next 40 minutes going through each folder, then swapped, hoping to catch anything the other might have missed. Geneva took notes, cross-referencing and underlining, but it was so early in the case that it was impossible to tell what was pertinent and what was not. There was nothing obvious. No criminal records, no red flags, but after going through the material for the 3rd time, she thought she could begin to discern the faintest flutter of repetition and coincidence. She reread the nuns' biographies, their qualifications, the work they'd done, the institutions they'd been part of, but nothing further struck her, and she realised she was looking at this the wrong way. She asked Singh to arrange the files in the order in which the nuns had joined. She noticed that Rupert had moved his stool a few feet closer to the table, and that there was a flicker of interest in his eyes which he couldn't hide. She waited until Singh was finished, then scanned the folders on the table, but she already knew what she would find. Mother Angelica had been at the convent longer than anybody else, she said quietly. Singh came closer and stared at the files. Geneva had placed each victim's photograph at the top of her file. Laid out like this, you could see the variety of expression and personality behind the strict habits and wimples, and, for the first time, Singh saw the nuns as separate individuals, each with their own distinct history, and realised why Geneva had done it this way. Which means, Geneva added, that all the nuns who were there when she joined have since left. Maybe they just didn't get on with her, Singh said, then caught herself. Sorry, I shouldn't be making jokes. No, Geneva interrupted. I think you might be on the right track. There's been a lot of turnover in personnel. The last nun to leave, Sister Rose, left only a year ago and was replaced a month later. In fact, she checked the dates again, everyone who died in the fire had been hired during Mother Angelica's tenure. It's almost as if she had been recruiting them. Why would she do that? Singh looked up from her stack of files. Maybe she knew them. Geneva thought about the dispute and how quickly Holden had dismissed her idea that the nuns had killed themselves because they thought the end of the world was coming. It made sense of the many contradictions of the case, why the nuns had died sitting peacefully at their tables, how anyone would know the exact time they'd all be gathered together, the locked room. She turned towards Rupert. Always 10 nuns, right? Always. Can you find out how many died while serving at the convent? Rupert was up before she'd finished asking. He crossed the room and sat down at a small table, logging on to a dusty white PC. Geneva watched his eyes, intense with concentration and excitement, as he waited for the results. Both his eyebrows shot up at the same time. Only 2, he replied. If only 2 were replaced because of death, then we have to assume that the others left voluntarily. How unusual is that? Does the diocese deal with such things, Rupert? No, that all goes through the Order's headquarters in the Vatican. He looked as if he was about to add something, so Geneva kept her mouth shut. Unfortunately, it's not as unusual as it once was, he finally said. It used to be that once you took your vows, you stayed wherever the Order told you to, but a lot of things like that have changed recently. What's the most common reason for a nun to transfer? Clash of personalities mainly. Still, he said, thinking about this,
For that number of nuns to leave the convent would be unusual even these days. It gave her an idea, the slightest glimmer of an idea, and she went through the paperwork and reread the deployment records, this time paying close attention to the dates. What did it mean, if anything, that 7 nuns had left the convent since Mother Angelica had become abbess? Geneva pulled out the relevant sheets and put them next to each other, then double-checked. The records had a detailed list of all postings, foreign and domestic, that the nuns had held. Geneva scanned names and dates and places, amazed at how their reach extended across the globe. 4 of the nuns had done missionary work in the Holy Land, 5 had been in Africa, 3 in the Philippines, 2 in China, and 1 in Papua New Guinea. But 7 of them had spent time in South America. She wrote down the dates and locations in her notebook. She cross-checked the list again. Some of the nuns had spent years in that continent, while others were there for only a short period. But there was just one place where all 7 nuns' paths had crossed. Peru, 1973, August to November. She turned towards Rupert, catching his eyes roaming her skirt, then pretending to look at something else, maybe the pattern of tiles on the floor. And how unusual would it be for them all to have been stationed in Peru at the same time? Rupert looked surprised. Not so unusual for them to be in Peru. Each nun normally does a few years of missionary work, he explained. But at the same time, and in the same convent, that's a big coincidence. Yes, it is, Geneva replied, looking down at the records again. All 7 nuns had spent the autumn of 1973 in the San Gabriel region of south-central Peru. She told herself not to leap to conclusions. Maybe it was nothing more than that they had developed a bond in that far-flung posting and that Mother Angelica trusted them, naturally giving them first refusal when a place opened up at the convent. Geneva made copies of the files she needed, thanked Rupert and started packing her things away when she remembered something that Gabby, the schoolteacher, had mentioned. "Rupert, that computer of yours, does it have details of the charity work that the nuns were involved in?" "No," he replied, seeing Geneva's face fall. "But I can get the register from the library. That should have the details," he offered. Geneva smiled and crossed her legs, watching Rupert exit the annex, his body taut with excitement and hurry. Men. She shook her head and turned towards Singh, seeing the sudden weight in the young constable's eyes that her joke had elicited. "Husband problems?" Geneva knew that Singh had got married last Christmas. She had also noticed that all the wedding photos surrounding her desk had mysteriously disappeared a couple of months back. Singh nodded and stared at the bright, hard ring on her finger. "He was never like this before we got married." She sounded sad and defiant and a little pissed off all at the same time. "Wants me to quit the job. Can you believe that?" "It doesn't surprise me." "He never said a word before we got married. Said the job made me even sexier in his eyes. Now all he talks about is me quitting, settling down, and fuck I know what's coming next." There was no advice Geneva could give. She'd screwed up her own marriage. She had a bitter ex-husband who was trying to cheat her out of her half of their house, and a head full of bad memories. "What are you going to do?" Singh looked up from her files with a muted rage in her eyes. "I'm not fucking quitting. Can you imagine me sitting at home with a baby, watching daytime TV, doing the laundry, talking to other mums in the playground? I'd rather be a nun." They both laughed, and were still laughing when Rupert came in. "What's so funny?" he said, blushing bright red, and they laughed even harder, unable to stop for a few moments. When they were done, Rupert showed Geneva how to use the charities register, and after 15 minutes she found what she was looking for. The convent had a long history of good works and philanthropy. Holden had been right about that, at least. They had run kitchens and emergency clinics during the Blitz,
soup lines and doss houses in the bleak, ravaged years which followed. In the last couple of decades, they had opened youth centres in blighted areas of Ladbroke Grove, been involved with the Terence Higgins Trust, run workshops for troubled teens, and fed the constant army of homeless that trudged through London streets day and night. They had also initiated drug rehabilitation programmes and organised neighbourhood watch teams to deter roving dealers unhappy with the police's efforts to do the same. It was a large and admirable CV, but it all stopped dead a year ago. The outreach programmes had been shut down. Memberships of boards and charitable organisations had been resigned, funding had ceased, and all of this over the space of a few weeks. Geneva sat up abruptly, checked her notes, and thought about this. We have reports that a priest named Father McCarthy was a regular visitor to the convent. Rupert nodded. Each convent has a diocesan priest attached to it. They come almost every day to conduct masses. He typed something into his computer, his expression turning into a frown. Father McCarthy was not their diocesan priest. Father Malone was. Would it be strange for another priest to visit? To visit, no. To visit regularly, yes. Do you have a photo of him? It would be extremely helpful for our inquiries. Rupert punched something into the keyboard and swivelled the monitor so that Geneva could see. A black and white photo of Father McCarthy took up half the screen. She looked at Father McCarthy's face, but she didn't look at it for long. There was something unsettling about the priest's expression, the way his eyes were hard and cold and seemed to stare out of the computer and into her very soul. Can you pull up his file? Rupert nodded and started typing. Got it, he exclaimed, and then she saw the screen flashing in front of him and the slump of his shoulders. The file's right there on the mainframe, but it's locked. Isn't that normal? Rupert shook his head. No, I've only seen this before in extremely sensitive cases. Child abuse scandals, financial embezzlement, that sort of thing. Chapter 16. The rush of stale air made him feel dizzy. The door flap had swung back on its hinges to reveal a narrow opening, about 3 feet high and 5 across. Carrigan aimed the beam of his torch into the room beyond and saw a bed and a grey concrete wall. He looked behind him, distracted momentarily by some low, growly sound, then crouched down and crawled through the gap. The room was a disappointment. Whatever he was expecting to find in the few moments between the door swinging open and entering, it wasn't there. The room was cool and had been preserved from the ravages of the fire. Dust motes danced and spun in the air as he straightened up and took in the space around him. It reminded him of an old prison cell, but it had been years since they had been allowed to be this small. The silence was absolute, and his tinnitus sounded like a gale blowing through his ears, a series of high-pitched whines and crackles that even after 20 years he had still not got used to. Sometimes, mostly in the lost hours of the night, he thought there were voices in the crackle, whispers between the sudden shifts of tone, a constant chattering of the dead broadcasting on some deep underground